Journal entry, Harpies. A traveler to the shores of Vestiria, the continent west of the homelands, would come across many strange and beautiful creatures. Even among this bizarre menagerie of beasts the harpy stands out due to its startling and disturbing appearance. At first glance the harpy appears to be a large bird of prey. They are forest creatures but are most commonly seen soaring through the air off in the distance with their lengthy feathered wings extended. Since harpies rarely allow humans to get closer than this, unless they are hunting them, this confusion is understandable. Like a bird they also have a sleek gray and white feathered body, and 2 rear legs that end in curved talons. Adults range in size anywhere from 4 to 4.5 feet in height, but they can appear larger when their wings are extended. Closer inspection however will quickly reveal features that exclude the beasts from the bird family. Most obviously the harpy has no beak, but possesses a toothy maw instead. It also has 2 large foreclaws that extend forth from its wings. These claws are used for both climbing and defending itself. Together along with a hair-like black crest on their heads these traits give the harpy an unsettlingly human-like appearance. The bodies of harpies have a graceful feminine shape, and when calm their faces are intelligent and even beautiful. However, when they grow excited or angry they open their mouths and their visages grow vicious and wrinkled. The transformation can be startling. These features place the winged raptors firmly among the ancient family of saurians. As the reader is undoubtedly aware the other notable member of this family that survives in Vestiria is the great drake. The resemblance may not be immediately apparent but like harpies drakes possess feathers, scaly skin, 2 sets of claws, and a mouth full of teeth. Harpies are social creatures capable of a wide range of vocal communication. They are even able to mimic other animals or human voices, an ability they use to taunt prey and lure it closer. Mainly however they communicate amongst themselves using shrill bird-like cries. Flocks of harpies gather together and create large communal nests on cliffs or above the forest canopy in particularly tall trees. These structures are constructed using mud, dried plants, and branches. Usually, these communal nests are a collection of muddy domed spheres. This provides the flock with warm shelter and protects their young from predators, other harpies, and the harsh winters of northern Vestiria. Most of a flock's nourishment comes from small animals such as rabbits and earth dogs, but they will also hunt larger prey. Frequently, these winged beasts hunt in loose flights of 3 to 6 members. They will split up and fly through the canopy looking for suitable targets. When one of the flight finds something it will signal its partners using innocent-sounding noises that won't alert its prey. They will then silently converge on the target and use their cries and mimicry to lure their prey into a disadvantaged position or to isolate it from the rest of its herd. Once they are reasonably sure of success the winged beasts will descend on their prey and tear it apart. Harpies will then carry chunks of their meal up to high branches where they are safe from other predators. This often results in grisly scenes where blood is splattered across and below the nearby trees. The ability of harpies to mimic human speech, their social nature, and their somewhat human-like appearance has caused some to speculate that they are intelligent creatures on the same level as man. This is not true in the least. Captured specimens portray no more intelligence than a dog, and are also completely untamable. They will play along for a while but always flee from their human trainers at the first chance they get. Peasants and rural nobility have been known to shoot the creatures on sight. This is due to the fact they have been known to attack children or livestock that wander too close to the woods. Being cunning creatures harpies now rarely let men or women get within bowshot if they see the person is armed. Folklore is filled of tales of harpies luring men to their death through beautiful singing. These tales are unlikely to be true though as such complex and detailed mimicry has never been observed. At most harpies have been noted to repeat a single short sentence. Still, it is a fanciful notion with a disquieting kernel of truth at its core. Another common myth is that all harpies are female, and reproduce with human men. This is obviously false. Male harpies are simply very feminine looking and hard to distinguish from the females. Truly, the harpy is a creature of unsettling contradictions. It seemingly blends the features of men and bird together but is actually neither. It is intelligent and beautiful, yet also violent, savage, and forever untamable. Far stidi uis de land mount, royal gervain surveyor. Along twisted paths 1. Erg. Die, the hobgoblin snarled in rage as he stared at his target with beady hate-filled eyes. With vicious intent he swung the axe in his hands down with all his might. The muscles in his back burned as he guided the sharp edge towards his defenseless target. The blade bit into the soft flesh of the log and cleaved right through it. 2 equal-sized pieces of wood flopped down onto the ground with hollow thud, leaving the axe head embedded in the stump beneath it. Meh, that time wasn't too bad. You're still putting too much effort into your swings, though. Just let the axe fall and you don't need to yell every time, the old human ranger named Cedar remarked casually from where he was seated several feet away. Black Nail gave him an annoyed look as he tugged on the axe handle to free it. Screaming makes the axe hit SS harder and faster, he pointed out. Maybe, but you're scaring the neighbors, the old scout replied. Black Nail looked around. Their neighbors were all hardened outlaws and members of Harad the Black Snake's bandit company. Most of them were used to the hobgoblin in their midst by now, a little yelling wasn't going to alarm them much. It wasn't like he was burning down the camp again. Why am I even doing this? It's boring and making me hungry, Black Nail whined. The hobgoblin had to suppress the urge to snarl and spit as a sudden wave of anger rose within him. The rush of energy made his teeth ache. Living among humans required that he constantly fight his violent urges. Yelling while chopping helped him suppress his rage, and it was one of the few ways to do it that wouldn't annoy his chieftain nor require him to dig any graves. Digging was hard work and he preferred to avoid it. Chopping wood is great for your back and will help your swordcraft. Plus, it's getting damned cold out at night so we need the wood, Cedar remarked. Black Nail felt like asking his master why he wasn't chopping wood then, but he suspected he already knew the answer. Besides, his master was right, it was getting bloody cold out. Over a week had passed since the attack on Herod's camp by the knights that had come looking for the ghouls Herod had wiped out. The days had been steadily getting shorter as autumn grew older. The smothering white of winter would soon descend upon the north. Black Nail wasn't really used to staying above ground when darkness descended, so the cold bothered him. He used to live in the sewer under a city to the south, before he'd been imprisoned and placed in a merchant caravan. Cedar had been the one who had freed him when Herod's band had attacked the merchants. There hadn't been a lot of perks involved in living in a mucky cramped sewer, but it had stayed warm in the winter. Of course, he'd only been a little goblin back then and not a magnificent hobgoblin. Black Nail set a new piece of wood on top of the log and raised the axe above his head. With a grunt of effort he brought it down again and continued his work. Chopping firewood was annoying, but it did supply his with a steady stream of stuff to burn. Black Nail loved feeding fire until it grew huge and roared wildly. The dancing red and orange flames were so pretty. They made him feel like laughing and clapping his hands together. "Do we have enough twine?" Cedar asked the hobgoblin as he idly whittled away at a wooden figurine. "We have enough for all the snares and to tie up the wood." Black Nail replied dryly. His master was clearly just looking for something to make him do. They always needed more rope and twine, but creating it was a chore. It had to be carefully twisted from specially prepared plant fibers. Ugh, it was annoying even to think about. "Then I guess you can take a break now and grab something to eat," the old scout told Black Nail. The hobgoblin smiled and set the axe down. All right, he was super hungry. What did he want to eat? There was plenty of dried meat and leftovers around, but he felt like gorging himself on something fresher. Black Nail stared past the nearby tents and log buildings towards the forest beyond them. Yes, he was definitely going to go out and get his own food. It was time to go hunting. As Cedar kept whittling away beside his tent, Black Nail stalked off towards the woods. He pulled up his hood and slipped through the bandit camp. No one gave him a second glance as he made his way to the edge of the trees. Unseen, Black Nail stepped through the thick bushes at the edge of the clearing and disappeared into the shadowy forest beyond. The sun was high in the sky, but its light was blocked by a smothering maze of branches and leaves. The hobgoblin took a second to look around. Even this close to the human camp there could be dangerous creatures lurking around. Nothing moved in the green canopy overhead or on the forest floor. The only sounds were of birds singing and the faint rustling of leaves by the wind. Satisfied that he was alone, Black Nail sniffed the air and began to circle carefully around the camp. He crept slowly through the underbrush and tried to camouflage with his surroundings. The prey he was looking for kept to a certain schedule that made them predictable. He knew almost exactly where to find his midday meal. Sure enough, after a few minutes of sneaking through the bushes he detected the telltale shuffling sounds of movement ahead. The cloaked hobgoblin dashed over to a thick brown tree trunk and pressed himself up against the bark. He then peeked out around it. His prey was in plain sight a few dozen feet away, and Black Nail had arrived at exactly the right time. The hobgoblin smiled wickedly to himself and licked his lips hungrily. The forest was incredibly dangerous and full of hungry beasts that would like nothing better than to devour humans and hobgoblins alike. Black Nail had run into more than a few of these while out with Cedar. There was also the possibility of another tribe of humans attacking the camp and sneaking through the woods. Thus, Herod had sentries posted around the perimeter of her base. That was what lay before Black Nail, a human sentry, and he was eating his lunch. The delicious smell of roasted meat and gravy rose from the plate in front of the man. A torn-off chunk of bread lay next to it. Black Nail sniffed the air again and the delectable aroma caused his stomach to gurgle in anticipation. Soon it would be his. The sentry was leaning against a tree trunk while he took a bite out of the bread. He held the plate in front of him as he lazily surveyed the forest out of the corner of his eye. The man was obviously more concerned with eating than watching, and thus deserved what was coming to him. I love bread with herbs in it. I need to get some more of this, the sentry mused to himself as he chewed. From behind the tree, the hobgoblin withdrew a good-sized stone from one of his pouches. He squinted as he took in the surroundings and roughly measured the distance between the sentry and himself. Then, Black Nail whipped the rock off into a nearby clump of tall thickets. There was loud rustling sound as it tore through the branches and a muted thud as the rock hit the ground and rolled. The sentry twitched and spun around towards the unexpected noise. His eyes were wide as he scanned the bushes for any signs of a threat. He was also looking in the exact opposite direction of Black Nail. This was a fact the hobgoblin took full advantage of as he closed in. The sentry was frowning in concern as he warily watched the bushes. Without looking down, the man carefully placed his plate of food on a nearby log. He then took several wary steps over toward the bushes. His hand was resting on the hilt of his sword. "If there's someone there, come on out," the sentry called. Behind him, Black Nail silently prowled closer. The hungry hobgoblin put on a sudden burst of speed, hopped over a rotting log that was covered in moss, and then grabbed the plate. It was his. "Hey, weird," the sentry remarked to himself as he studied the bushes. With his prize in hand, the hobgoblin turned and hurriedly scuttled behind a nearby tree and away. He clutched the meat-covered plate to his chest as he ran. There was no stopping him now. The sentry relaxed when nothing emerged from the bushes and attacked him. With a happy little sigh the man turned and started walking back to where he'd been eating. Suddenly, he let out a frustrated yell. "No, what the hell's? Where did my bloody food go? This is the second time. What keeps taking my damn lunch? Ack, I'm bloody hungry," the shocked scout swore in disbelief. Black Nail giggled to himself as he cheerfully hopped back through the forest and towards camp. He was the sneakiest and cleverest member of Herod's band for sure. Taking food from sentries was the perfect crime. No matter what happened, they were supposed to stay on guard so they couldn't give chase. They also couldn't complain about losing their food to anyone. Doing so would be admitting that they hadn't been paying attention on watch. It wasn't an actual crime though, and nothing like thievery. Black Nail wasn't a thief. He and the sentry been engaged in a contest of skill, with the food being a prize for the winner. That was nothing like stealing. Black Nail would have given the man something if he had been spotted, but he hadn't been. The hobgoblin took a seat atop a large stone on the edge of the woods. From there he could see into the camp, but he was still mostly out of sight. The brown of his cloak and the green of his skin made him blend in with the forest. Swiftly, he began slurping down his meal. When the last bit of food had vanished into his stomach, he belched and started to plan his next move. He wasn't quite full yet, so he needed to get more grub. Luckily, he knew where to get some. Black Nail got up and headed over to meet with Varus. The man owed him a huge favor and had promised him tasty treats. The young, at least next to Cedar, bandit scout had taken a goblin as a pet. The wretched little thing was named Scamp, and he was a stupid greedy little thief. After a few minutes, Black Nail arrived in front of Varus' tent. The young scout was sitting in front of a fire pit and frying up some eggs. They crackled and cooked on top of the pan he was holding above the flames. Scamp was tied up beside him and curled up close to the fire. There was a content look on the goblin's dreaming face. Black Nail didn't like it. "Ah, I thought you might stop by," Varus remarked as he looked up and saw the hobgoblin. A while ago, the goblin had stolen some magic crystals and raised a huge ruckus. Black Nail had heroically tried to catch him, but the little bastard had still managed to annoy Herad. As a result, she had wanted to get rid Scamp. Out of the goodness of his heart, and for the promise of a lot of treats from Varus, Black Nail had agreed to become responsible for training the ugly runt of a goblin. "I see Scamp still hasn't run away," the hobgoblin observed. The goblin in question woke up and yawned. He noticed the hobgoblin and a sulky expression appeared on his face. Black Nail didn't like it. "My little buddy wouldn't do that. He's a loyal companion and a great sniffer. He just needs some discipline," Varus remarked as he petted Scamp affectionately. Cedar had almost never petted him when he had been a goblin. Black Nail would have to remember to give Scamp a good kicking later when Varus wasn't around. He was obviously spoiled rotten, and it would be for his own good. About that training, Black Nail slowly drawled. "Yes, you can have some food. I have a spare egg here and some honeyed fruit tucked away," Varus told the hobgoblin with an obvious hint of amusement. Black Nail frowned at the man's words. Apparently, he had gotten predictable. That wasn't good. Well, whatever. It couldn't be helped if it was about tasty treats. Several minutes later, the hobgoblin was once again walking through the camp with food in hand. He licked his lips as sucked on the last bit of sugary fruit in his mouth. It was delicious. He was still kind of hungry, though. Should he go find Geralt? That man was almost always easy to get food out of, and he tended to have good stuff. Black Nail decided against it. Cedar would be looking for him, they had practice soon. His master was teaching the hobgoblin how to shoot a bow, and it hadn't been going all too well. "There you are. What took you so long? Don't make me wait for you," Cedar huffed as Black Nail arrived back at the spot where their tents were set up next to each other. "I'm coming," the hobgoblin replied as he grabbed one of the bows that were laid out next to Cedar's tent. Now that lunch was over, the camp was becoming busier. Herad's minions were getting back to work. The sounds of wood being sawed and hammered filled the forest clearing. It hadn't been that long since the bandits had set up here on top the old abandoned farmhouse, but a lot of work had been done. Most bandits had moved out of their tents or lean-to and moved into log cabins. Several more buildings were still being constructed in the clearing. Winter was coming, and this was the north. Tents were fine for the other seasons, but the snow and cold would be deadly in the winter. If Herad wanted most of her minions alive come spring, she had to make sure they were prepared. Food, firewood, and clothing all had to be stockpiled. Log cabins and barracks weren't the only thing being built either. Defenses also had to be constructed. Wooden watchtowers had been thrown up by the road near the entrance to the camp. Barricades were being built to stop not only attacking monsters from the forest but also people approaching from the road. Herad had plenty of human enemies. Off to one side of the clearing there was an area that was still mostly empty. That was where Black Nail and his master headed. They had set up a series of targets there yesterday. "Just take your time and stay focused," Cedar reminded Black Nail. "No problem ss, this is easy," Black Nail replied cheerfully. The hobgoblin was good at everything, so he obviously couldn't be bad at archery. All those misses and injuries from last time were nothing but flukes. "Just remember that you have to retrieve any arrows that go astray, so no more shooting at birds," Cedar reminded him with a glare. "They look tasty," Black Nail muttered to himself in frustration. "You get more than enough to eat. I'm surprised you're not completely round by now. Focus on learning to shoot, you big green idiot," Cedar harshly replied with scowl. With a sigh, the hobgoblin strung his bow and knocked an arrow to it. His master didn't need to call him names, that was mean. Besides, he was still much thinner and prettier than a big fat pink human, and that was unlikely to ever change. The steel point in front of Black Nail's eye pointed right towards the red circle that had been painted on the piece of board he was aiming at. With a confident smile, the hobgoblin let the arrow loose. There was a muted thrum as the bowstring vibrated and the projectile whizzed through the air. The arrow raced towards the target, and then flew right past it without coming within 5 feet of it. "I could hit it easily with a rock from a sling," Black Nail muttered in disappointment. "Well, I don't feel the need to stay here and watch this travesty. Just keep shooting until you get a feel for it, if you ever do," Cedar told the hobgoblin. The old human scout then shook his head and wandered off. Black Nail took his time lining up his next shot. There was no point in rushing now that Cedar was gone. He would just tire himself out and it was still early in the day. He had other jobs to do later, like sword training with Vorsha. Life with Cedar was basically a never-ending series of chores, so you needed to know how to pace yourself. The hobgoblin's next arrow also flew off into the grass without going near the target. Black Nail eyed the bow in his hand skeptically. There had to be a trick to this. Maybe if he screamed threats really loudly while shooting, or if he pretended the target was Scamp. Along twisted paths too. Alright, that's enough, Fall and you too, Vorsha shouted to Black Nail and Kita. The two of them were going through a simple two-person sword form. When they heard Vorsha's command, they immediately stopped, sheathed their practice blades, and started walking towards her. Both of them were sweating and panting after almost an hour of hard practice under the large woman's supervision. Alright, it's time for something a little different. If you two keep repeating the same stuff, you'll both develop bad habits, Vorsha explained. Great, I'm ready for the real stuff. No more babying around, Kita exclaimed excitedly. Vorsha threw her a quick skeptical glance before continuing. Alright Geralt, get up here, Vorsha called. The smaller man was sitting off to the side of the patch of trampled grass that Vorsha had claimed as a training arena. At the sound of his lover's voice, he looked up from the book he was reading with a startled expression. Who, me? He asked in surprise. Yeah, you, lover boy. Come over here, Vorsha told him with a bemused roll of her eyes. Geralt got up, and put his book down on the crate he had been using as a seat. Then he reluctantly dragged himself over to join Vorsha and her students. Vorsha gave him a quick smile of greeting, and then looked over both Black Nail and Kita with a thoughtful expression. Right, so Black Nail, you'll be sparring with Geralt. Don't let him fool you, he's not as useless as he looks, she told the hobgoblin as she held out her practice blade for Geralt to take. I will watch him carefully, and he will not fool me, Black Nail replied as he smiled in anticipation. He had wanted to spar with Geralt ever since he had first challenged the man months ago. His opponent though looked more than a little unsure. Geralt had stared at the sword blankly for a few seconds before he reached out and took it. Are you sure this is a good idea? It might be too much of a challenge for beginners like the pair of them, he asked Vorsha confidently. Go easy on him then, she replied as she smirked in amusement. Hey, what about me? Kita interjected irately. The young redhead had an annoyed look on her face, and her arms were crossed in front of her. She was clearly annoyed at being ignored. You can go sit over there, and wait your turn, Vorsha replied dismissively. She then gave the much smaller woman a shove in the direction of the crate Geralt had been sitting on. Kita scowled but did as she was told. She grumbled to herself the entire way over though. Now the rules will the same as when you spar with Kita. I'll give points for knocking the opponent off balance, or touches. I expect Geralt will be more of a challenge for you though, Black Nail. He has a somewhat different style, Vorsha explained. Hey now, not everyone is a former mercenary. I learned swordplay from a proper dueling master, even if I wasn't a very good student, Geralt remarked, as he swished his sword playfully through the air with one hand. I understand, Mistress Vorsha, Black Nail replied as he observed his opponent. With a quick smile, Geralt took a few steps back, and brought his blade up to assume a stance. Black Nail took a stance as well, but there was a frown on his face. He didn't recognize the stance Geralt was using. It was very different from any he had seen before. He wasn't even holding onto his sword with both hands. Are you ready, Black Nail? Geralt asked the hobgoblin. Yes, I'm ready, Black Nail answered lazily. Then without warning the hobgoblin attacked. Black Nail lunged forward in an attack designed to take full advantage of his hobgoblin's speed, but Geralt was already slipping to the side. The hobgoblin's attack passed him harmlessly by, and Geralt's own blade sliced into Black Nail's way. Black Nail's eyes widened in surprise, and had to immediately duck under the unexpected counterattack in order to avoid walking right into it. The startled hobgoblin then quickly took a step back, so that he would have time to figure out what had just happened. He had never seen a move like that before. You're very fast, Geralt remarked thoughtfully. You're sneakier than you look, Black Nail replied. Thanks, his amused opponent replied, as he carefully circled around the hobgoblin. When Kita fought she was energetic and daring, and when Vorsha fought she was graceful yet unstoppable. Geralt was like neither of them. He was constantly moving but always watching as well. Black Nail took a small step forward, and his opponent stepped to the side and slightly adjusted his stance. The hobgoblin took a step back, and Geralt moved again as well. Black Nail frowned as he realized his opponent was preparing to counter his moves before he even made them. He didn't know what to do about that, so he decided to just rush in. Black Nail started another lightning-fast attack, but this time when Galal had moved to deflect his blow he was ready and shifted. His first attack had been a feint to set up his second. Galal had grimaced but managed to block the second blow. Black Nail launched a series of rapid-fire slashes, in an attempt to knock his opponent off balance. However, a frantic-looking Geralt managed to avoid or deflect all his blows. Growing impatient, Black Nail felt a spike of anger and stepped in to try another attack, only to have Geralt meet him halfway and bat his blade down. The man then delivered a solid, but controlled, blow to Black Nail's shoulder while he was off balance. Point for Geralt, Vorsha announced. Damnation's SS, the hobgoblin hissed, as he let his blade drop. As he hissed, his anger subsided slightly, and he began to focus on his breathing. He found that swearing like his master and the other bandits helped him quench his anger, and right now it needed quenching. He had allowed his rage to take control and paid the price. Just thinking about it almost made him angry again. It had been a while since he had made that mistake. What really annoyed him though was that unlike when he was fighting Cedar or Vorsha, the fight with Geralt had actually been a close fight. If he hadn't lost control, he might have actually won. That's 1 point for me and 0 for you, Geralt bragged as he smirked at the hobgoblin. Enough talking, start round 2, Vorsha interjected loudly. I'll get SSU back, little man, Black Nail told Geralt as he raised his blade again and took a stance. The unconventional bandit and the hobgoblin fought several more rounds. Black Nail lost the first few, but then he managed to adjust to Geralt's style and win 2 bouts. He simply overwhelmed Geralt's ability to predict him by constantly changing the direction of his attacks. Eventually, after both combatants grew exhausted and sweaty, Vorsha called a halt to the sparring. Seeing that the other two were done, Kida got up and walked over. Hey, I thought you'd be even worse than that, she told Geralt. Geralt, however, wasn't insulted. He just gave her a smug smirk. If I was actually a terrible duelist, I wouldn't be here, or a wanted man. I would be dead at that bastard Byron's hands. Instead, I did the world a great service and put that thrice-damned son of a whore in an early grave, Geralt replied cheerfully. You shouldn't brag about not being terrible at something, aim for excellence instead. You need to practice as much as Black Nail, and I don't know how can you think your petty vengeance was worth exile. Vorsha told him. It wasn't petty. Byron hurt my family, and ruined my sister's reputation. Beating him in a fair duel, and running my blade through his heart as I looked him in the eye, was the best moment of my life, he replied. And having a murderer for a son didn't hurt your family. Vorsha replied dryly. Dueling may be illegal in Eloria, but it's still considered an honorable way to end a dispute. So I might be a criminal, but I'm not a common criminal. Besides, if I hadn't done it I never would have met you, he replied with a suggestive grin. Oh, I make it all worth it, do I? Stop trying to deflect, you silver-tongued demon. Sometimes I swear you're pig-headed enough to be a noble, instead of just a merchant's son, Vorsha remarked with a smile. Ha, I bet your bounty is really tiny though. Only the real dangerous criminals get good bounties, Kida told Geralt in a condescending tone. It's 3 silver, but don't worry, I have a plan to increase it. I'm going to murder a whole bunch of innocent villagers and dump their bodies in front of the nearest bounty office, Geralt remarked sarcastically as he glared at Kida. Hey, I was right, that's almost nothing, the young woman bragged. It's enough to get me hanged by total strangers if I don't watch my back. It's also more than you have, since you're the only one here completely without one, Geralt replied. Kida looked around for a second and frowned, but she smiled when she saw Black Nail. Black Nail doesn't have one either, she countered. You are once again ignorant. He has one. All hobgoblins have a bounty of 5 silvers on their heads. For some reason people dislike having them as neighbors. Their bounty can even get higher if the local peasants find something to blame them for. I figure that if he keeps hanging around with us his bounty will rise quite a bit. He might even become famous, or infamous anyway, Geralt had explained. A high bounty isn't a good thing, Vorsha added with a frown. Oh, what's yours then? Kida asked with obvious interest. Doesn't matter, Vorsha replied stiffly. I can answer this question. She got a price on her head when the count that was employing her refused to pay her mercenary company its due. Instead, he decided it would be cheaper to just trump up some charges and put a bounty on her head. A quite spectacular 5 gold bounty at that, Geralt had explained with an amused glance towards Vorsha. It wasn't even a tenth of what he actually owed me, Vorsha replied in disgust. I could buy a mansion for that much. Kida exclaimed in surprise. Well, a half-decent house anyway, as long as it was fairly small, Geralt had corrected her. One day I'm going to get an even bigger bounty than that. Everyone will be terrified of me, Kida announced proudly. Geralt gave her a doubtful look and Vorsha frowned in concern. That's enough talking, Kida. It's your turn to spar with me, she told the younger woman. Vorsha and Kida then started sparring, and the larger woman dominated the other inexperienced fighter. After they had finished training, Black Nail went to rest at his tent for a few minutes. Now that he was done being trained, it was time for him to do some training. The hobgoblin walked over to an area beside his tent where Scamp was sulking. He knew the goblin would be there because that was where Black Nail had tied him up. He had slapped a leather collar on him and attached a rope to it. Then he had looped the rope around a nail on a post that was too high for Scamp to reach. Of course the goblin could have gotten loose by chewing through the rope, or several other ways, but Black Nail had made it very clear he would rip the little fellow's eyes out and eat them if he did any such thing. The rope simply reminded the forgetful goblin that he wasn't supposed to move. Scamp whined pitifully as Black Nail approached, but the hobgoblin didn't care. He ignored the goblin and instead focused on the rabbit pelts. Today he had given Scamp the job of scrapping them clean, and getting them ready for drying. Black Nail hissed angrily as he noted the goblin's poor progress, and Scamp flinched at his reaction. The hobgoblin knew the lazy little runt was just trying to get out of work by acting pathetic though. Varhus may have let him get away with that, but there was no way Black Nail would. No food SS for you until you're done, he reminded the goblin before turning and walking away. Days passed without anything exciting happening. However, Black Nail was able to get Scamp to act at least sort of disciplined. He even began letting Varhus take him for walks, as long as the scout promised to be stern with the goblin. The man was probably lying, but Black Nail didn't care that much. Eventually, it was almost time for Herat and her chosen escort's departure. She called a meeting in the farmhouse she used as a headquarters to go over the final preparations. Her usual lieutenants were there, including Cedar, Red Dog, Vorsha, and a few others. Black Nail hadn't technically been invited, but no one had said he wasn't either. Thus he had followed his master most the way over, and then took up position outside one of the windows. From there his sensitive ears could hear everything being said inside perfectly, although a human would have had problems. Tomorrow I'll be leaving with several dozen men. As I told you before, Red Dog will be staying here to command in my stead while I'm gone, and Vorsha will serve as his second, Harad told her minions. She was seated in a simple wooden chair and a matching table had been placed in front of her. Everyone else was standing in a loose group before her. I can't say I like the idea of you leaving with so few men. We have powerful enemies in Dagger Point, Red Dog replied with a concerned frown. I agree. Warwick has sworn to kill you, and his men will easily outnumber yours if he's in town, Vorsha added with a nod. So what? That's always been the case. 4 dozen is about what I've taken every time before this. It's only recently I've even had more, and when we arrive the first thing I'll be doing is recruiting. I know somewhere I can get some trustworthy men, Harad replied. The rookies will need supervision to make it through the winter, and won't be up to the march north either, Cedar remarked to Red Dog. True, I guess that does limit how many men you can take, Red Dog admitted with a frown. Everything in life is a gamble of one sort or another, but enough of this. I didn't call you here to question my decisions, Harad told them coldly, as she stared up at them from her seat. Yes, mistress, Red Dog immediately replied as he snapped to attention. On top of my personal guard I'll be taking you and Mahedium with me, Harad told Cedar. Why me and the mage? He's gonna be slow, and I'm not much use in a place like Dagger Point, the old scout replied with a frown. Oh, you're wrong as usual, old man. I'll have a use for you there. Your name still carries weight in certain circles, if only the gods know why, and that will help me drum up some muscle, she replied smugly. As for the mage, he asked to come and promised it would be worth my trouble. He wants to try digging up some fellow black spell slingers to trade notes with. Well, Dagger Point is probably his best bet for that. There's usually 1 or 2 mages around, but anyone he finds in that pit is likely to be just smart enough to know which end of a staff to point at the enemy. You don't need too much in the way of brains to be a combat mage, Vorsha commented. He thinks it will be worth his while, and who knows, maybe he's right. Harad said with a dismissive shrug. There was then a squealing sound as she pushed her chair back and got to her feet. After a brief look at her lieutenants she walked over to the nearby window. The hobgoblin hiding outside heard her coming. He quickly scampered over to a bush off to one side, and then went very still. I'll leave early tomorrow morning with the dawn, so make sure you're all ready. When I return no one will be able to challenge my claim on this territory, and that's just the beginning. Harad announced to the air outside the window. She then turned back around and looked at Red Dog. When I get back I expect this place to be fit for a queen, so no slacking off, she told him as she smiled wickedly. Now off with you lot. I have stuff to do, and I'm sure you have your own concerns. After her dismissal everyone quickly left, lest they annoy their boss. Red Dog threw Harad an uncertain look before walking out through the door. He was unsure how serious her command about fixing the place up had been, but if she noticed his concern she didn't bother to enlighten him. Black Nail continued to sit in the bush outside the window for a few seconds until everyone was out of sight. Just as he was about to get up he heard something from inside the house. Soon, it will all be mine. Harad whispered lovingly to herself, before chuckling hungrily in anticipation. Soon the chuckle died down, and there was only the sound of breathing from inside. Very carefully Black Nail got up and crept away. He was reassured that Harad was confident in her plan, despite the others' doubts. The more powerful the tribe got the higher his own position could grow, so Black Nail approved of her ambition. She was obviously looking forward to victory a lot too. Black Nail got like that sometimes, standing over the corpses of your enemies just felt so great. It felt like someone was tickling your brain, and you just wanted to keep on smiling. The hobgoblin got up and sped around the building. He had to get back to the campsite before Cedar started to question what he had been up to. As he moved he watched the camp for people who looked to be paying him too much attention, and he thought about what he had just heard. Mistress Harad had mentioned that Cedar would be going with her, but no one had mentioned him. Black Nail found himself wishing he could go with Cedar to this human place called Dagger Point. Things had begun to grow boring around the camp, and he kind of wanted to see a human city again. He had lived in one for years as a goblin and roamed the streets at night after all. With the clothes Cedar had given him Black Nail didn't think he would have too much trouble doing similar things again. Only now he could think of much more exciting things to do after dark, and he knew he could find tastier things to eat than garbage. The city would also be full of targets that weren't part of his tribe, and thus he would have no reason to hold himself back. It would be nice to finally let loose. Discipline was important, but that didn't mean he could never have fun. Black Nail shivered in eagerness as he pictured it. He could almost already taste the blood. Along twisted paths 3. No one had said it directly, but from listening to people talking Black Nail swiftly came to the conclusion he wasn't invited to join Harad's expedition. That wasn't going to stop him though. He was looking forward to visiting a human city again too much to let a simple lack of permission get in his way. So as night fell and everyone went to sleep he started scheming, and he quickly came up with a foolproof plan. The best way to make sure he was included in the party sent to Dagger Point was simple, he wasn't going to ask. If no one knew he was there they couldn't tell him to go back. The next morning when Cedar was getting up to get ready to go Black Nail was nowhere to be found. The hobgoblin had woken up even earlier than usual, and had quickly made his way out into the woods as if he was checking the snares or hunting. However, he had no intention of doing his usual routine. As soon as he was out of sight and safely hidden in the forest he stopped to make sure no one else was around. Black Nail then stealthily crept through the bushes around the edge of the camp. When he got to the road he selected a nearby tall tree that overlooked the area, and then he scrambled up it. The bark of the tree was grey and rough, but once he got up into the branches it was easy climbing. Climbing trees took a lot less effort since he had become a hobgoblin because his limbs were so much longer. Once he was a couple dozen feet up he stopped and hid on a particular leafy branch that gave him a good view of the surroundings. Then the hobgoblin simply waited for the expedition to leave. It only took a few minutes for something to happen. Unseen, up in the tree Black Nail watched Herad, Cedar, and the rest of their group pour out of the camp and head down the road. As he watched he caught a brief glance of red hair. Wait, was that Kida? They were taking that useless human whelp and not him. Why? The hobgoblin glowered down at them from his leafy perch. When they were out of sight Black Nail smiled gleefully again though. He'd show them how sneaky he could be. It was time for him to put his plan in action. He hastily climbed down to the ground, and then hurried back through the woods to the far end of the camp. Once back in the clearing he calmly walked over to his campsite and packed up some of his things. If he had done it beforehand it would have alerted Cedar. There was no way his master would have missed something so obvious. That done he picked up his pack and once again strolled over to the back of the camp. He got a few odd looks but no one said anything. Not that a lot of people usually struck up casual conversations with him anyway. Once back in the woods he once again circled through the forest towards the road. He stayed hidden and out of sight among the trees for a few minutes as he moved parallel to the road. He didn't want anyone in the camp to see him leave, but moving through the brush was slow so he soon had to move onto the road. By this time Herad's group had quite a lead on him, but the hobgoblin could keep track of them by their scent. Even if they left the road he wouldn't have any trouble finding them. As Black Nail jogged down the road in pursuit the scent grew stronger until he knew he was almost upon them. The hobgoblin then slowed his pace and grew careful. It would be very bad for him if he was spotted now. When he finally caught up he risked only a quick glance at the humans, before falling back out of sight and continuing to track them by scent. Herad was leading the way and dressed in her usual attire. Cedar was walking directly behind her, and the rest of the bandits followed him. They all had long hooded travelers' cloaks meant for keeping people warm and dry. Only when they slowed or stopped did Black Nail slip into the woods and observe the humans while concealed among the trees. He kept careful watch on Cedar in particular. If anyone was going to spot him it would be his master. As they walked Black Nail had a lot of fun trailing Herad's group. Some part of him just loved the act of stalking. It filled him with eager energy and just felt right, like he was doing what he was meant to. He didn't mean his tribe any harm, but it was still exciting to fool them. After a few hours though the humans stopped walking and came to a stop. The reason for this was both very obvious, and very alarming. The forest was full of the sound of cracking tree branches and the thud of heavy footsteps. The source of the noise was easy to spot. Several massive brown creatures were moving through the edge of the forest along the path ahead of them. They were easily the largest creatures Black Nail had ever seen, much bigger than even the troll had been. Like trolls they had 2 thick legs and 2 long arms, but that's where the resemblance ended. They were easily 3 times as tall as any man, many more times as heavy, and covered in thick brown hair. Most of them moved ponderously on all 4 limbs, but every once in a while one would rear up onto its back legs and walk around that way for short distances. It would then reach up into nearby trees and rip branches down. The end of their arms ended in truly impressive claws that shredded the wood effortlessly. There were 5 claws on each hand, and they were as long as swords. Black Nail was too far away to get a good look at their blunt faces, but 2 large curled horns rose from their heads. The beasts brought the leafy branches they tore down from the trees to their mouths and chewed them. That meant they were either eating some very slow and stupid tree rats, or they were plant eaters. The hobgoblin vaguely remembered his master mentioning something like them, but he had forgotten their name. Feeling extremely curious, Black Nail used the distraction the creatures were creating in order to move closer to Herad and the others. He wanted to hear what they were saying. Carefully, Black Nail slipped into the bushes at the edge of the road. He then stealthily made his way right up behind the position the bandits had taken. They had stopped on the road a fair distance from the giants, and were talking amongst themselves as they watched the beasts. Black Nail managed to get within 24 feet of the humans. That was more than close enough for him to hear everything they said, even with all the noise the beasts were making. Ogres will move on in a bit. We just have to be patient. There's no reason to leave the safety of the road. Right now they're watching us. If we all stumble into the forest we might spook them, and that could end badly, Cedar was telling Herad. The bandit chieftain was looking impatient, and not completely convinced by Black Nail's master's words. She was scowling at the ogres, and her hands were on her hips. She looked like she wanted to single-handedly kill the beasts that had dared slow her down, but then she sighed. Fine, tell the men we'll be resting for a bit. We'll be doubling the pace when the way is clear though, to make up for lost time, she said. Cedar nodded and then moved to fulfill her orders. He moved slower than usual and didn't make any loud noises, probably as not to spook the ogres. As Black Nail's master had suggested the bandits simply held their position and waited for the ogres to move away from the road. As the minutes passed the giants continued to move ponderously from tree to tree so they could eat the leaves and fruit. Every once in a while an ogre would turn towards the bandits and give them a curious or wary look, but they didn't seem too concerned by the presence of humans. That was definitely a good thing because Black Nail didn't think even Herad could take on several of the gigantic beasts. It would be like a goblin trying to wrestle a large man, the goblin would without a doubt end up stomped flat. Just as Black Nail was beginning to relax, a deep roar suddenly pierced through the ogre's racket. Instantly, the giants all stood up on their hind legs and looked alarmed. They scanned the forest, as it grew eerily quiet in every direction. Even the birds went silent, and deep sense of unease started to grow in Black Nail's gut. "Hells, a drake," whispered Cedar, as all the bandits around him grew stiff with fear. "It's not close, right?" one of the other bandits asked him fearfully. "SHH, shut your trap," Cedar hissed back at him in reply. Another louder roar filled the air. The sound seemed to ricochet through the trees, and caused Black Nail a shiver to crawl up his back. His instincts were suddenly screaming at him to find a nearby hole and disappear down into it. If he hadn't been worried about losing sight of his master, he might have listened. Cedar seemed to be listening intently. When the drake had roared a second time, his head had whipped around, and he was now staring at the forest behind the ogres. "Shit, we need to move. Now," Cedar warned Herad urgently. Before he could get a response, the sound of splintering wood and the unmistakable boom of a falling tree echoed through the forest. Several of the ogres flinched, and Cedar immediately started running back down the road the way they had come. "Fall in and follow or you're dead meat," Herad commanded everyone before taking off after the scout. With a scared snort, one of the ogres dropped down on all fours and started to flee. After a second of hesitation, another ogre quickly joined it. Then with a chorus of alarmed huffs and snorts, all the giants took off in pursuit of the first two, and almost directly towards where the bandits were standing. Several of the bandits froze for a second as the ogres barreled towards them. Most of them though immediately joined Herad in retreating out of the stampeding beast's path, and the rest were quick to follow. Several of them looked like they were screaming and shouting in fear, but Black Nail couldn't hear them over the thunderous noise of the running giants. The ground was shaking beneath him and he could see the leaves of nearby trees shaking. The vibrations made running more difficult than usual, which was bad because the ogres were headed in Black Nail's direction. The hobgoblin had wasted no time, he had started running as soon Herad had. On all fours he scrambled through the trees at the side of the road after his master. He whipped through bushes and tore up dirt and leaves as he ran. He could hear the ogres growing closer, and didn't want to find out what they thought of hobgoblins. A bright red fox red suddenly burst out of a nearby thicket and began racing alongside the hobgoblin. They both gave each other surprised looks, but neither stopped running or even changed directions. Black Nail heard the sound of splintering wood behind him, and redoubled his pace. His heart was beating frantically in his chest. Being near the stampeding ogres reminded him too much of when he had been a little goblin, and beneath the notice of larger creatures. Then the thud of heavy footsteps started to die down. Black Nail gave a relieved sigh and let himself slow down. The fox that had been running beside him sped off into the trees. Now the noise of the stampeding ogres had almost completely faded, and the forest no longer seemed to be shaking. Black Nail leaned against a nearby tree trunk and sucked down a quick breath. Gradually his heartbeat returned to normal. He was tired after such a hard sprint, but glad to still be alive. Once he had recovered, he went to check out the road for signs of his tribe. He glanced around a tree at the forest's edge and saw that Herad and her minions seemed fine. They were just recovering from their own mad sprint. Cedar was motioning everyone off the road and into the ditch beside it. Black Nail smiled after he saw that everyone was all right. He would have hated it if they had decided to turn back around and go back to camp. Just then there was another loud boom. Black Nail whipped around to look a fair distance up the road towards its source. He was just in time to see a massive shape bound out of the trees and across the road, before disappearing into the forest on the other side. It hadn't been an ogre, it had been much larger and faster. Black Nail gulped as his stomach twisted in fear again. The hobgoblin had only got a quick look at the creature, but unlike an ogre it had obviously had a long neck and tail. It could only have been a drake, one of the rulers of the forest that Cedar was always telling him about. The most dangerous creatures you could run into, and likely the last. Both Herad's group and Black Nail stayed still and hidden for the next while. Only after several long minutes had passed did the bandits get up and resume their trek to Dagger Point. Black Nail followed them as closely as he could without being seen. He really didn't want to be left behind right now. Much to everyone's relief, no more drake screams were heard, and the rest of the day was fairly uneventful. It began to get dark, but Herad kept pushing them to keep going. Black Nail was starting to wonder if they were even going to stop for the night when they came upon an abandoned stone building at the side of the road. Even in the dark it was easy to see it was in poor repair. It bore signs of once being an impressive building, but there was an obvious hole in the roof and one of the walls had collapsed. It would still be a much safer and drier place to sleep than outside though, so the bandits all headed inside. As Black Nail moved to follow them, he noticed signs of other long decayed wooden buildings among the grass and bushes. A sizable human settlement must have once stood there, but now only the one large building remained to remind travelers that a flourishing village had once stood there. The hobgoblin could see and hear much better than the humans in the darkness, so he had no problem creeping up to the building in the dark. The bandits were just setting up camp and building a fire for the night. The light from the flames served only to hinder the human's night vision and make his approach easier. The hobgoblin slipped up beside one of the outside walls. He watched and listened for a while through a small hole that gave him a clear view of the inside. It was pretty boring stuff though. The only thing even remotely of interest that he learned was that the building was called a temple, and supposed to be good luck or something. Soon the bandits started going to sleep, and that was really tedious to watch, so Black Nail moved away. He had to figure out where he was going to rest for the night as well. He hadn't brought his tent, but he had brought a pair of blankets. Carefully, Black Nail explored the area around the temple. Crumbled stone bricks and thick bushes surrounded the old building. A few dozen feet away through the darkness the thick growth of the forest loomed. The hobgoblin didn't want to move too close to the dark woods. He had no idea what might be lurking out there. He could hear crickets chirping and leaves rustling, but it was what he couldn't hear that worried him. He had been reminded earlier that no matter how experienced you became, the forest always contained new unseen dangers. He felt much safer closer to Cedar and the bandits than out there. He couldn't get too close to them though, or he would be seen. After a few frustrating minutes spent circling the temple, Black Nail noticed firelight flickering through a window near the roof of the building. With a surge of excitement, the hobgoblin began to climb his way up to it. The old weathered stone walls were easy to grip, he just had to watch out for loose bricks. Once up there he found a shadowy ledge that was concealed from both below and outside. It was the perfect place to sleep, so Black Nail laid out his blankets. He then briefly glanced down at the bandits and Cedar. They were gathered around their fire and most of them were asleep. Cedar appeared to be on watch though because he was one of the few still up and about. Black Nail's master was drinking something from a cup while seated on a piece of rubble. He was looking outside into the darkness through one of the doors, but then he leisurely turned and looked up towards the hobgoblin's hiding spot. Black Nail leaned into the shadows and held his breath, but Cedar soon turned back to the door. He didn't appear to have seen anything because the old scout was still relaxed and casually took another sip from his drink. Black Nail turned away and lay down on his spread-out blankets. As the light of the flames below flickered over the roof above him, the hobgoblin gave a silent yawn, and closed his eyes. It didn't take long for sleep to overcome him. Along twisted paths 4. Herad's group was out and moving early the next morning. They continued their march north, but nothing more interesting than the occasional passing traveler happened. Herad mostly ignored them, she had places to be and better things to do than rob peddlers and peasants. No one who had anything worth stealing traveled alone in the north. When night came, Black Nail usually slept up in a tree just out of reach of the light of the human's fire. The next day they passed a few more abandoned villages, but no occupied ones. This confused the hobgoblin. Who had created all these villages and why had they been destroyed? Had some monster from the forest leveled them? They did pass the occasional large walled human settlement, but Herad avoided them. Black Nail considered scaling one of the walls in the night but thought better of it. He would have plenty of time for that when they got to Dagger Point. The scenery began to change as they continued their journey. The grey and white mountains that rose on the horizon started to grow ever larger. The terrain also became much rougher, and the road began winding up hills and along tall rocky cliffs. The steeper terrain was harder to traverse, so the bandits grew tired and their progress slowed. At one point they had to cross a rickety wooden bridge over a river. The river was extremely wide, and its frothy white waters roared as they swept down from the distant mountains. There was no way anyone could possibly swim across the raging river. After everyone else had carefully crossed the bridge, Black Nail eyed it suspiciously. It was quite possible that Cedar would have left a lookout on the bridge, just in case someone was following them. The hobgoblin was so paranoid about it that he waited a quarter of the day before crossing. Luckily he had a large advantage over humans in that he could follow their scent. There was little chance of him losing them. He did however have to run quite a bit that day to catch up. When he finally found them again, it had grown dark, and his human tribesmen were setting up for the night. Idly Black Nail wondered how long it would take to actually reach Dagger Point. He probably should have figured that out before he followed Herad north, but there was no going back now. He hoped it wasn't too much longer, his feet were getting more than a little sore. Black Nail lazily circled the humans' camp as he once again searched for somewhere safe to sleep for the night. As he was creeping through the woods he heard a noise out on the road. At first he thought one of the bandits had slipped past him, but then he dismissed that as unlikely. Cautiously, he slipped through the dark woods to check it out. He was fairly sure it wasn't anything too dangerous, but you could never be too sure out in the wilderness. What he saw surprised him. There were two humans walking along the road, and headed for the light of the bandits' campfire. Feeling curious, and rather bored after several days by himself, the hobgoblin decided to investigate. The two humans didn't appear to have any obvious weapons, so Black Nail flipped his hood up and walked out of the bushes. He heard a gasp of shock and saw the two darkened forms flinch as he emerged onto the road. He didn't want to scare them right away, so he raised his hand in a human gesture of greeting. "Hello, I won't harm you," he announced in his best imitation of a human voice. "Who are you?" "Are you from the fire?" the larger one, who smelled male, asked him. "I'm a friend." "No, I'm not from the fire. They're bandits, and bad. They'll take your stuff and kill you," Black Nail replied. The two humans glanced at each other. They seemed very unsure, and suspicious of Black Nail. The hobgoblin didn't know why, he thought he was doing a very good impression of a human. "How do we know you're not the bandit and trying to lure us away from safety?" the man replied. Black Nail hesitated and scowled. The stupid humans didn't even know when someone was trying to help them. How could they not trust him? He was very honest. "I could take you to get a look at them," he offered. If these humans were going to be so annoying, then Black Nail was just going to leave them, or kill and rob them himself. Maybe they had interesting shiny things he could take? The pair leaned close and whispered to each other for a few seconds. Then, the shorter one who smelled female spoke up. "No, that's fine. We hoped to find safety at the fire, but deep down we knew finding refuge there would be too convenient. It was unlikely at best that anyone friendly would be out here." "Thank you for the warning," she told him with a heavy sigh. The woman, and that's definitely what she sounded like, looked tired and miserable. The man reached around her shoulders and pulled her closer into a reassuring hug. "We shouldn't complain since we're lucky you were here to warn us. I don't suppose you have somewhere safe to rest for the night?" he asked. Black Nail thought it over. He had been scouting the forest for a while looking for somewhere to rest. In that time he had discovered a small cave. He had initially disregarded it because it was too big and open for one person, but with 3 people they could set a guard. "I found a cave earlier. You could rest there," he offered. "That sounds better than staying out here in the dark," If you don't mind me asking, what are you doing out here, and what's your name? The man asked him. Black Nail hesitated as he tried to figure out what the right answer was. He knew his name was odd for a human, so he said the first name that popped into his head. I'm Cedar, the man. I was out hunting when I saw the fire, so I snuck up and spied on them. I'm very sneaky, he told them. Black Nail was rather proud of his lies. How could the humans not believe him? They were perfect. This was turning out to be rather fun break from all the walking. Right, well, let's see this cave of yours, the man told him. With a nod of agreement, Black Nail led them through the woods away from the bandits and down an incline. There, the cave mouth was visible in the exposed rocky side of the hill they had just come down. It was however too dark to see inside now, at least for a human. Is it safe to light a lantern, do you think? The man asked Black Nail. Yes, there's no one to see it here, the hobgoblin replied. The man then reached into his bag and withdrew a small metal hand lantern. It smelled of ash and oil to Black Nail. The man got out a flint and steel and began trying to set the lantern wick alight. It took a few seconds to catch properly, but then the surroundings were lit by the small flickering flame. The man held the light up in front of him and the inside of the cave was revealed. The cave only extended a little more than 24 feet past the narrow gash in the rock that served as its entrance. There was however plenty of room for 3 people inside, and it served as shelter from both the wind and observers. It's going to be awfully dark inside there when we snuff the lantern, the woman remarked. You set up. I'll get some wood for a fire, Black Nail told the pair. That'll be very dangerous in the dark, the man said in concern. The hobgoblin just shrugged and started walking back to the road. I'm very sneaky, he replied as he disappeared into the dark. Black Nail wasn't stupid. He wasn't going to wander the woods looking for dry wood. That did indeed sound like a good way to get killed, and it was totally unnecessary. He just had to borrow some wood from Herod's group. They were all the same tribe, so it was kind of his wood anyway. By this point most the bandits had drifted off to sleep, except for the 2 men on watch. It was thus a simple feat for Black Nail to creep up through the blind spot created by some of the tents, and make off with some of their wood and tinder. They had a fairly large pile of wood piled up against one tent. It was now substantially smaller though, and it amused Black Nail greatly to wonder what they would think when they noticed it was missing. He almost considered waiting around to see their faces, but that could take forever and would be dangerous. When Black Nail got back to the cave, the pair of humans he had saved from the bandits had finished settling down for the night. The woman was lying down on a low rock ledge. Her rough traveler's clothes were placed beside her, and she was between a pair of thick blankets. The man had set his own gear down, and unpacked his blankets on the ground close to her. He was standing guard inside the entrance of the cave instead of resting though. He seemed tense and stiff as gazed out into the darkness, but he relaxed a little when he saw Black Nail approach carrying a heavy load of wood. The lantern was behind him on the ground in the center of the cave floor. The light it cast was very weak and barely illuminated the cave. I'm glad you're back, Cedar. I was getting worried about you. Where did you get that wood? It looks like it was split with an axe, he asked. I knew a place to get it, the hobgoblin explained as he walked inside. Ah, a huntsman's cache. You must travel through here a lot. We were truly fortunate to run into a good man like you, the man told him. Black Nail just gave another shrug and begun setting up the fire. He was pretty great, but he wasn't a man. He smelled much better for one thing. He built the small fire near the cave's mouth so smoke could escape, and so it would serve as a barrier against wild animals. He was careful to face away from the man so that the shadows concealed his face as he worked. Once he had succeeded in using his flint and steel to light the tinder and wood, Black Nail withdrew into the far corner of the cave where the shadows were deepest. He didn't want his new friends to get a glimpse of his green skin. In the dark corner he started setting up his own sleeping place. As he was working, the man started talking again. I'm sorry for not introducing myself earlier, Cedar. I'm Rickes, and that's my wife Celestia. We're traveling north, for our own reasons. Thanks again for helping us. I wish we had some way to repay you, but we don't have much, he said. Got any cheese? Black Nail asked hopefully. He really liked cheese. Yes. I have a small piece left. You're more than welcome to it, Rickes replied uncertainly before digging through his pack and tossing Black Nail a small package. The hobgoblin caught the cheese. He could already smell its poignant scent through the cloth it was wrapped in. Cheerfully he unwrapped it and then slowly savored its sharp taste. He had eaten all his cheese days ago. Well, Cedar, I can tell Elorian isn't your first language. What is your native tongue? The man asked the hobgoblin. Black Nail froze in the middle of eating. There was more than one human language? Why? He didn't know of any other languages. What was he supposed to say? Luckily, Rickes noticed his hesitation, and interpreted it in his own way. I'm sorry if it sounded like I was prying. I was simply trying to make conversation, but I see now that you are a private person, he said apologetically. No problem. Do you want first watch? Black Nail responded in relief. That's fine with me. I'll wake you when my watch is over, Rickes said. Good, but just call out Black Nail to wake me. Don't get too close. I'm a private person, Black Nail replied as he placed his sheathed sword against the wall in a very obvious gesture. Rickes looked confused for a second, but then nodded in understanding. Ah, I see, that's a code word of some sort? Anyway, I assure you that we're no threat to you, but I'll do as you ask, he told the hobgoblin. Black Nail then sat down and leaned his back against the wall. He had placed his blanket beneath and behind himself to serve as a cushion. His form was still completely concealed by his clothes, hood, and the shadows. He wasn't too concerned about the humans sneaking up on him as he slept. He was a very light sleeper when he wanted to be. The next morning Blacknail woke early and went out scouting. When the rest of his tribe had gone down the road he headed back to the cave. After a brief talk with Rickus and Celestia they parted ways. The pair once again thanked him profusely for all his help. The hobgoblin rather liked all the praise they were giving him. He was glad he hadn't let them wander into Harad, and that he hadn't killed them either. As he sauntered off in pursuit of Cedar and the others, he heard the pair talking to each other. I know he saved us, but he's still creepy. Neither of us got a look at his face the entire time we were with him. He was always completely covered by his clothes, and never got too close to us. That's more than a little odd, Celestia murmured to her husband. True, but he probably has his reasons. Maybe he's a wanted man or is scarred. Why else would he hide his face, and live out here? Rickus replied. What about his voice, she countered. He probably has a damaged throat, or was hiding his voice as well, her husband guessed. Maybe, but there's still something off about him. Something different, she replied doubtfully. What, you think he was secretly one of the forest people? Like in the myths where travelers stumble upon a mysterious stranger who helps them out or tricks them. You didn't accidentally promise him our firstborn, did you? Her husband asked teasingly. I know you're joking, but I can't help but think that you just might be right. It would certainly explain a lot, Blacknail heard Celestia say before they were out of his hearing range. Blacknail would have liked to stalk his new friends for a while and hear more of their conversation, but he was in a rush. Harad and his master had gotten quite a head start on him now. He broke into a light jog when he got back onto the road so that he could catch up. Harad must have been pushing her minions hard because even after an hour passed Blacknail had yet to catch a glimpse of them. He would have worried but the scent of their passing assured him that he was still on their trail. As he jogged down the forest road he came across a break in the trees. On one side of him the forest was replaced with thick heavy bush. There were only a few scattered young trees growing there. Without the heavy tree cover to stifle it the hobgoblin felt the wind around him pick up. Its caress cooled him off and felt refreshing as it blew under his clothes. Blacknail thought he saw what looked like a collapsed building deep within the clearing. It reminded him of what Harad's base had looked like when he had first seen it, but with more bushes. The whole area must have once been a human farm that was now slowly being swallowed by the forest. He continued jogging along, but when Blacknail was about halfway through the clearing a rustling noise caught his attention. It was probably just a rabbit or something, but just to be sure he slowed his gait and focused on listening for a second. The sound of several more things moving alongside him in the bushes reached his ears. That wasn't good. Rabbits didn't move in packs and stalk hobgoblins. Feeling a surge of acidic panic work its way up from his gut Blacknail picked up his pace, and gripped his sword hilt. If anything decided to jump him he was going to give it a face full of steel. That would discourage most of the things that lived out in the wilds, but unfortunately not all of them. The sounds moved closer and Blacknail noticed the bushes began to tremble as something ran through them. Whatever these things were they were clearly not afraid of him. He sniffed the air for a hint of what was approaching, but the wind was blowing in the wrong direction. All he could smell was trees and earth. Suddenly up ahead of him the shrubs shook as something launched itself out of them. A shocked Blacknail had to throw himself to the side to avoid the stone projectile that whirled past his head. He landed on all fours and hissed in alarm as a creature stepped out of the bushes and cut off the road in front of him. He had never seen one before, but he knew without a doubt what it was. His opponent answered his hiss with a screech of challenge. The figure wore a dirty hide loincloth and brandished two crude stone axes high above its head. Its skin was green and two horns rose up from its unruly grey hair. It was a hobgoblin, and it had brought friends. Shrieking goblins began to emerge from hiding all around Blacknail until he was completely surrounded and couldn't escape. The goblins waved rocks and crude stone-tipped spears in his direction. Their eyes were filled with hate and cruel excitement. Human shit, Blacknail swore nervously from where he was crouched on the ground. He had accidentally stumbled into the territory of another hobgoblin. Along twisted paths 5. Blacknail was very badly outnumbered. He drew his sword and dropped his pack on the ground. Furious goblins encircled him. The green swarm was shrieking and waving their crude stone weapons. It would have been comical if not for the mad gleam in the goblin's eyes. He didn't do more than glance their way though. Blacknail's own eyes were locked on the hobgoblin that stood in front of him. If he looked away it would be a sign of weakness, and one he couldn't afford. The other hobgoblin's crude loincloth did little to conceal its body, so it was obviously male. It glared evilly at Blacknail, and growled as it raised its axes threateningly. The weapons looked to have been made from pieces of chipped stone that had been secured to fire-hardened branches. They were obviously crude weapons, but still very dangerous looking. Out of the corner of his eye Blacknail observed the goblins around him. They hadn't attacked him yet, but when they did they would swiftly overwhelm him. They might be small and weak but there were a bloody lot of them, and they seemed quite angry. His best bet was to deal with the hobgoblin quickly, and hope that would scare the goblins into submission. Of course the other hobgoblin was noticeably larger and older than Blacknail. Several long pale scars decorated his exposed skin, and a particular nasty-looking one ran down his left eye. His most distinct feature however was his black horns. Both of them were over half a foot long and branched like small antlers. They were impressive, and Blacknail found himself more than a little intimidated by them. His own horns had never really had a chance to grow because he had taken to filing them down. They might look imposing but horns made disguising himself and wearing hats impossible. Still, he really wished he had a pair now. Black Nail hissed angrily and waved his own weapon around as he took a step towards the hobgoblin. He needed to make this a challenge between the two of them. There was no way he could defeat the swarm of goblins as well as their hobgoblin leader. Hey, stupid tree head. You're ugly, and I'm going to cut you up, Black Nail growled as he took another step forward. He knew the other hobgoblin couldn't understand his words, but he didn't need to. There was no way he could misunderstand Black Nail's tone of voice and body language. The two hobgoblins postured and growled at each other for a few seconds as they slowly moved closer and began to circle each other. The watching goblins' howls of anger turned to excitement. They were now eager to see the two hobgoblins fight. Black Nail smiled, he had succeeded in making this a one-on-one fight for dominance. He took another step forward, and then suddenly lunged. He slashed violently down at the other hobgoblin with his blade. His opponent reacted faster than anyone Black Nail had ever fought before. He easily hopped back out of the attack's range, and instead of counterattacking he simply eyed Black Nail's sword suspiciously. Black Nail frowned as he realized his enemy was far from stupid, and knew how dangerous his sword could be. That changed things slightly. Before he could think through the implications though, the other hobgoblin attacked. One of his stone axes hurtled towards Black Nail's head as his opponent swung it. Even while surprised, Black Nail knew better than to try and block it. The axe was heavy, and the horned hobgoblin was bigger and stronger looking than him. Instead, he slipped to the side and out of the way. The second axe soon followed. Black Nail's opponent jumped and swung it down at him. Again Black Nail tried to slip to the side, but just as he was readying his counterattack, the other goblin threw his first axe. Black Nail was caught off guard and flinched as the axe hurtled towards his face. He jerked his sword up and desperately tried to deflect the savage projectile, but he only managed to graze it. The axe bounced off his weapon and smashed into his shoulder. The weapon didn't hit edge first, but it still cut into him, and it definitely hurt a lot. Black Nail let out a hiss as pain ripped through his side. The attack left only a small cut, but his arm had gone numb from the impact. Black Nail growled loudly as he sized up his opponent anew. The horned hobgoblin was hanging back and watching Black Nail for any sign of weakness now. Around their small patch of road the goblins were jeering and chattering excitedly. Things were still relatively even though. Black Nail's one arm was injured, but his opponent had lost a weapon. Rather than show weakness before his opponent and the watching goblins, Black Nail attacked again. He unleashed a flurry of quick slashes at the horned hobgoblin's body and hands. His opponent countered by stepping back and trying to smash Black Nail's blade down with his own heavier weapon. Black Nail's lightning-fast slashes drew blood and opened several small gashes on his opponent's arms and ribs. He smiled victoriously as the scent of his enemy's blood filled the air. However, Black Nail's sore arm suddenly flared with pain and his last slash faltered. His opponent seized the opportunity and brought his axe down on Black Nail's blade. The stone edge of the hobgoblin's crude axe shattered, but the impact shocked Black Nail's injured arm and it went numb. He lost his grip on the sword, and it was ripped painfully from his hands. The horned hobgoblin shrieked joyously and dropped his own damaged weapon. As Black Nail was still reeling in pain, the other hobgoblin leapt and tackled him to the ground. Black Nail was knocked onto his back, as his opponent landed on his chest. The horned hobgoblin straddled Black Nail, reached down, and began to viciously strangle him. Black Nail coughed as his throat was forced closed and he lost the ability to breathe. He tried to wriggle and escape, but it didn't work. The feral hobgoblin grinned gleefully down at him as he chocked the life from him. Black Nail felt himself grow lightheaded and weaker, as he futilely tried to suck down air. With his opponent's superior strength and weight, it was nigh impossible for Black Nail to get free. So he didn't try. Instead, he reached under his cloak with his good hand and drew his dagger. Then, he brought it up and savagely stabbed the horned hobgoblin in the side under the ribs. Then he did it again, and again. Then he did it one last time just to make himself feel better. His opponent coughed, and blood splattered all over Black Nail's face. The other hobgoblin went slack and then shivered as his grip on Black Nail's neck loosened. Herod's minion unceremoniously pushed his now twitching and coughing opponent off, and then rose to his feet. Around him the circle of goblins had gone silent and they now stared at Black Nail intently. Black Nail repressed the urge to fall over and stared them down. Then, the goblins suddenly broke out into shrill cheering, and rushed over to surround him. Their excitement was obnoxiously loud. The goblins pressed against him as they tried to reach out and paw the victor. Black Nail would have pulled away, but they came at him from every direction at once. Soon he was being jostled and pushed as the swarm around him moved. The surprised hobgoblin tried to shove through them and escape from the mass of unwashed goblins. The little critters had really dirty hands. Black Nail didn't know what they had been touching, but he knew he didn't like the fact they were getting it all over his clothes. One of the goblins broke away and stepped over to examine the pack Black Nail had dropped earlier. The hobgoblin saw him and growled menacingly as he tried to push the goblins away. "Mine. Back, you little thief," Black Nail barked angrily. The swarm of goblins around him scattered as his furious yell rang in their ears. The startled goblins retreated from him and began running around and yelling as well. Black Nail ignored them and knocked any goblins in his way out of his path as he lunged towards his pack. The goblin that was riffling through the contents of the backpack saw him coming and quickly ran off into the nearby bushes. Black Nail briefly checked to make sure that nothing was missing before quickly snatching his bag up. Then he patted himself down to make sure none of the goblins from earlier had stolen anything, and of course they had. He was missing a dagger in a pouch. "Little thieves, bad goblins," he hissed as he scanned the nearby goblins for signs of his stuff. He saw his pouch in the hands of one of them, and moved to grab it back. He was too slow though, and the green thief slipped away into the bushes at the side of the road. Black Nail growled and immediately followed after him. He swatted branches and plants out of the way as he pursued his target through the thick scrubland. His arm was still sore though, and he was quickly growing tired. This feral pack of thieves was beginning to really annoy him. He followed the goblin for several minutes until he stepped out of the bushes and into the ruins of an old human house. It looked to have once been fairly large, but it had long ago crumbled away. Only an uneven square of cracked bricks a few feet high remained to mark where the house's exterior walls had once stood. The ground between the ruins was still hard-packed enough that only a few small plants and grass grew there. The result was a small clearing, and the place reeked of goblins. As the hobgoblin looked around, he spotted a pile of ashes and burnt stones that marked the location of a fire pit. It had clearly seen recent use. Other signs of goblin activity, such as tracks and small animal bones, littered the area as well. Black Nail heard the bushes behind him shake and he glanced back over his shoulder to see several goblins emerge from the bushes behind him. They cringed and lowered their eyes submissively when he threw a glare their way. He ignored them, they weren't a threat anymore. Goblins such as these feral pipsqueaks would never pick a fight with a hobgoblin such as him. Their natural place was below him. Now Black Nail just needed to find his pouch so he could get going. Every minute he wasted here, the rest of his tribe got further and further away. He scanned the surroundings for signs of the thief, and quickly spotted what looked to be the entrance to an old basement or cellar hidden among the rubble. He smiled and headed towards it. The rough stone and mortar walls of the stairway were still intact, but the steps had long ago shifted and eroded. This made the walk down the ruined stairway treacherous. Luckily, Black Nail had both very good night vision and excellent balance. It took his eyes a few seconds to adjust to the dark, but when he made it to the bottom of the passage he got a good look at the goblin's den. It was a large room big enough to hold dozens of people, or many more goblins than that. Like the stairway down, the old cell's walls were rough stone with mortar holding them in place. The room had obviously originally been constructed by humans. The floor was packed earth, but Black Nail was unsure if it had always been that way or if the dirt had built up after it had been abandoned. Signs of goblin habitation were everywhere. Collected bits of feathers, wood, and human trash were scattered around the floor, not to mention several insects buzzed around among the garbage. The only sources of light were the passage behind Black Nail and a small tunnel some of the goblins had dug in the far wall. Goblins always had more than one entrance to their dens, so that they could flee from predators. It looked big enough for a hobgoblin as well, but it would be a tight squeeze. Over in one corner there was a flattened pile of dried plants and bits of cloth. It looked like the horned hobgoblin's old bed to Black Nail. He sneered at it, his bed was much better. The hobgoblin then noticed his pouch on the ground beside the rear tunnel. He quickly jumped over and scooped it up before another goblin could appear and make off with it. He felt relief wash over him when it was back on his hip where it belonged. He was glad he didn't have to spend any more time looking for it. Just then a feeling of dizziness overcame Black Nail, and he realized he was starting to feel tired and sore from his earlier fight with the hobgoblin. That didn't surprise him, he had kind of gotten the shit kicked out of him. His opponent had got a few lucky blows in. He moved over to the grass bed in the corner and sat down. He just needed a moment to rest, and this den was probably safer and more comfortable than anywhere else he could find. As the hobgoblin surveyed the room around him, his throat suddenly tightened and he was overcome with a feeling of homesickness. It wasn't quite the same, but the cellar definitely reminded him of the sewers he had grown up in. That seemed like a lifetime ago now, even though it had only been several months. So many things had changed. His arm gave a twinge of pain, so Black Nail removed his cloak and shirt to get a better look at it. The cut had already stopped bleeding, but there was a really nasty deep purple bruise forming around it. Black Nail winced as he examined it. The gash was really going to start hurting once the rush from the fight wore off. He was not looking forward to that at all. That stupid feral hobgoblin, with the alright-looking horns, had gotten lucky during their fight. Carefully Black Nail began to clean and wrap the cut using supplies from his pack. By the time he was done, his earlier excitement from the fight had completely worn off. Black Nail yawned as the fatigue from the struggle and all his traveling caught up to him all at once. He decided to take a quick nap, just for a bit, so that he had some energy for the road. With a little rest he would probably be able to move faster anyway. Lazily, Black Nail took out his flybane and began applying it. Once he had applied enough to keep the bugs away while he rested, he yawned again. Then, he laid his head down on his pack as if it was a pillow. He would just close his eyes for a second so he could rest better. Black Nail woke to the grumbling of his stomach. For a second he wondered why he was so hungry, but then he sniffed the air. The hobgoblin quickly sat up and looked around. Several goblins were cautiously loitering around the den, and they had apparently laid out a spread of food for him. A collection of berries and nuts were piled on some leaves in front of him, and that wasn't all. They had also placed a dead rabbit there and returned his knife as well. Black Nail eyed the nervous-looking goblins, and then sniffed the food warily. It smelled very good, better than the dried human food he had been eating on the road. Maybe this tribe wasn't so bad after all. Black Nail quickly scoffed the berries and nuts down, which just left the rabbit. He grabbed both it and his knife as he headed up above ground. Goblins scattered nervously out of his way when he moved. As he climbed the slippery passage upwards he was alarmed to see that it had grown darker. Hopefully it was just some cloud cover. Quickly, he jumped outside and looked up at the sky. The sun was starting to set, he had slept for almost the entire day. Damnation SS and rot, he cursed in frustration. He would never be able to catch up with the rest of his tribe before night now. That left him only two options. He could either take his chances and sleep alone in the forest by the road, or stay here for the night. There were also his injuries to consider. The smell of his blood would draw predators to him like flies to shit. With a resigned sigh, Black Nail placed the rabbit carcass on a nearby rock and went to gather some wood. Several goblins trailed after him. It didn't take long for him to gather up quite a bit of wood. The area was full of it, and as he worked more and more goblins joined him. In the beginning only a few of them silently followed him around, but as he gathered up pieces of wood and tinder they began to whisper among themselves and copy him. Soon almost 24 goblins were running everywhere and collecting fuel for the fire. An amused Black Nail soon stopped doing the labor himself and instead headed back to get a fire started. As he worked to light the tinder, goblin after goblin appeared to drop loads of twigs and branches at his feet. Soon he had far more fuel than he needed, and a roaring fire. As the flames roared higher, even more goblins appeared to see what was going on. Black Nail counted about 36 of them, which was probably the entire tribe. There were several small goblins and pregnant females among them. They must have been hiding from the unknown hobgoblin when he first arrived. He didn't blame them. Goblin leadership transitions were often bloody, even without throwing hobgoblins into the mix. Black Nail didn't care about them in the least, so he ignored them, and started skinning the rabbit. He enjoyed eating them raw, but after so many days on the road he felt like hot food. In fact, he felt like more than just rabbit. Had he seen a pot below? Black Nail wandered back down into the den. His memory was right, and in one corner of the room there was a large blackened steel pot. The humans must have left it behind when they deserted the village, and the goblins had claimed it when they moved in. Among the trash he also found several wooden mugs and bowls. The hobgoblin grabbed all the stuff and dragged it up to the fire. Working quickly, he grabbed a large branch and stuck it into the ground on an angle so that it leaned over the fire. Then he propped it up by placing a rock under it, and another atop the buried part. Now he just needed some water, and some other ingredients. Black Nail turned to the closest goblin and repeated the word his tribe had used for water. The goblin just tilted his head to the side and gave Black Nail a bewildered look. The hobgoblin sighed and began to lap up imaginary water from his cupped hands. It was more than a little embarrassing. This was really beneath his dignity. The goblin just continued to stare at him with a confused expression. However, another goblin off to the side made an excited sound and rushed over. This goblin's eyes were wide with recognition, and he began to gibber excitedly. He was an average-sized goblin with a slight blue cast to his skin and a few strands of gray hair on the crown of his head. Black Nail made a shooing motion towards the bushes. His eager helper ran up to the border and looked back to see if the hobgoblin was following. Black Nail went after the goblin and trailed him for a few minutes until they came to a small bubbling creek. After scanning it carefully for any sign of a concealed tyrant turtle, he approached it and took a drink. That done, he filled the 2 cups he was holding and gave one to his guide. When they got back to the den, the hobgoblin tried to explain what he wanted to its little green residents. After several embarrassing failures, Black Nail managed to get the goblins to start filling the pot using the bowls and cups. Soon, after that, he had them bringing him wild carrots and other common herbs. He chopped up all the ingredients and threw them all into the pot, and then he hung the pot from the branch above the fire and waited for it to boil. About an hour later, the pleasant aroma of stew filled the air above the goblin den. After Black Nail had finished eating, there was still a lot of stew left, so he offered it to the goblins. Tentatively at first, but then with eager excitement, the tribe began taking mugs and cups of the stuff and drinking it down. Judging by their excited murmuring, and the brawls that broke out over bowls, they really liked it. Several goblins tried to drink directly from the pot, but they stopped after Black Nail kicked the first few across the clearing. As the sky darkened and the stars began to come out, Black Nail found himself sitting around a fire with an entire tribe of goblins. They scampered around energetically and chattered incomprehensibly among themselves. It reminded Black Nail of his life in the sewers, but was also disturbingly different at the same time. He was now very unlike how he had used to be back then. He couldn't even picture himself as one of the little green runts that were running around him. It wasn't even that he was a hobgoblin now, life with humans had changed him. As he stared at the feral goblins, Black Nail realized he no longer saw the world the way this tribe did. They had such tiny short little viewpoints. They were just focused on simple things like food and shelter. When they saw the road at the edge of their domain, what did they think? Did they wonder who had made it or where it led? Black Nail sighed as he realized a simple life like this would never satisfy him anymore. He couldn't believe he had ever wanted to return to the sewers. He would stay here for the night, and in the morning seek out Herat and the rest of his tribe. Humans had much better food anyway. A long twisted path. 6. Black Nail grunted in annoyance. It was too late to try and go after his master, but he had just woken up from his earlier nap, so he wasn't going to be able to fall asleep anytime soon. He didn't really want to sit around and watch a bunch of dirty goblins gulp down stew either. Even Black Nail couldn't believe how messy they were. The hobgoblin was used to doing chores when he had spare time, so out of habit he looked around for something to do. His gaze stopped on the pile of wood. It shouldn't be left out in the rain, so he decided to build a shelter for it. He got up and began to construct a lean-to against the remains of one of the nearby brick walls. He used some of the larger branches the goblins had brought him, and tied them together with twine to form the roof. Then Black Nail stood back and admired his handiwork proudly. The goblins behind him murmured in appreciation. The hobgoblin froze. What in all the hells was he doing? Why was he building these little green pests' furniture? With a disgusted grunt, he sat back down by the fire. He slouched over and rested his chin on his palm as he gazed into the flames. For a few minutes he enjoyed staring at the crackling dance of the blaze, but he quickly grew bored. He had depleted some of his stock of rope earlier, so he decided to replace it. He walked out into the bushes by the road and began to gather plant fibers. When he returned, the goblins had not only replaced all the wood he had used up but actually made the pile substantially larger. Black Nail ignored them and began to twist the fibers together to make rope. As he worked, several of the goblins copied him. The hobgoblin gave them a disdainful look, as if they would be able to do it properly. It had taken him weeks to learn to do it, and he was a genius. A few minutes later, when Black Nail next looked up, he saw several of the goblins working together to make near-perfect rope. He felt his jaw grow slack and fall open in shock. That wasn't possible. There was no way these feral little runts should be able to do it so easily. Then, Black Nail remembered the other hobgoblins' axes. They had used similar cord to keep the stone heads attached. Obviously, the goblins had already known how to make twine. That made sense. They had probably practiced for years to manage the feat, while under the threat of strict punishment. Still, maybe they weren't as dumb as they looked. It was some time before Black Nail grew tired. Before then he had not only made 2 more lean-tos and replaced all his rope, but also constructed a door for the den's entrance. He'd made it from more branches and tied it down using twine and stakes. He was planning on sleeping down there anyway, so having a door directly benefited him. He obviously hadn't done it for the goblins. That would be stupid. Several nearby goblins were playing with their new door as they squealed in excitement. Black Nail shooed them away, flipped the door open, and re-entered the den. Once down there he scowled. It was dark enough now that even with the door open and goblin night vision he was having some problem seeing. That wouldn't do. Black Nail walked around the room until he found a section of the wall where the stones were crumbling. Using the deceased horned hobgoblin's axe as a hammer, he opened a small hole there. Then he shoved a nearby goblin into it and forced the gibbering runt to dig its way to the surface, as he motivated it with pokes from his sword. His fireplace was thus completed. It only took a few seconds to fill the newly dug shaft with wood and light it with a burning branch from the other fire. He removed the goblin first, of course. A burning goblin would undoubtedly make a truly hideous amount of noise. Black Nail had gotten the idea for the fireplace from the one in Herod's house. With the light from the fire and the help of several eager goblins, Black Nail was able to clean the place up a bit and lay out his blankets. The final touch was to scatter flybane around to ward off the bugs. With that done, Black Nail had created a comfy place he actually wouldn't mind sleeping in. In fact, it was actually pretty nice. Moving around so much had caused his wounded shoulder to hurt, so Black Nail laid down on his blankets and went to sleep. Just before he slipped unconscious, he thought he felt several warm bodies cuddle up next to him. It could have been a dream though. As the sun was just peeking over the treetops the next morning, Black Nail opened the new trapdoor he had built and stepped outside to greet it. He had everything packed and was ready to continue his journey to Dagger Point. Feeling fully rested, he made his way through the bushes and back onto the road. He was going to have to travel quickly if he was to have any chance of finding Herod and the others' trail. With that thought, the hobgoblin broke into a fast jog. Just as he was about to leave the bushy scrubland behind him, he heard a shrill screech fill the air. Black Nail looked back to see a flock of harpies circling the goblin den from high up in the air. He then heard the unmistakable yelp of a terrified goblin. He hesitated and grunted in annoyance as he watched the harpies circle. Stupid bloody feral good-for-nothing runts, it served the goblins right for attacking him. The hobgoblin took another step forward but then froze. He was totally not responsible for them just because he had killed their chief. That wasn't how it worked. Black Nail let out a long resigned sigh and turned around. He raced back to the clearing in time to see one of the circling harpies dive. Below it, a goblin was desperately attempting to scramble through the bushes towards the entrance to the den. It didn't look like it would make it. Black Nail was prepared though. He had already pulled out his sling, and he immediately sent a stone whirring towards the diving harpy. His hasty shot missed, but it definitely caught the raptor's attention. The sound of the stone shooting past it startled the harpy, and caused it to abandon its dive. Instead, it fluttered in the air for a second before winging its way across the clearing. The goblin it had been aiming for reached the trapdoor and slipped under it. The other harpies that were still circling up above began to screech angrily. Black Nail eyed them warily as he pushed his way through the scraggly bushes and back towards the den. When he burst into the ruins of the old home, one of the flock detached itself and dove towards him. Black Nail whipped another stone at it, and this time it hit. The harpy squawked in pain and dropped from the air. There was a loud thud as it smashed through the bushes and into the ground. Black Nail gave the mangled body of the downed raptor a brief look over. He was fairly confident it was dead. That had been quite the lucky shot, or maybe he was just super skilled. That only left 5 more harpies. Black Nail hoped they would give up now that they knew how dangerous he was. He was really strong and fast after all. They wouldn't gain anything from attacking him. Suddenly, the air above him was filled with the furious screech of vengeful harpies. Moving as one, the entire enraged flock descended upon the hobgoblin. Black Nail swore as his eyes widened in alarm. Maybe that hadn't been a lucky shot after all. A surge of panic rushed through Black Nail as he sprinted for cover. He could hear the harpies descending upon him, so he quickly measured the distance to the den's entrance as he ran. It was obvious he wouldn't make it, so he swerved and threw himself aside at the last moment. The first 4 harpies missed and blew past him in a gust of wind, but the last one caught the edge of his cloak with its hind claws. The furious raptor then began to slash at Black Nail with the long claws on the end of its wings. Luckily, its efforts were hampered by the hobgoblin's clothing. Black Nail rolled and ripped his cloak off, with the harpy still attached to it. He then drew his dagger and stabbed at it. The flailing creature slipped away from him, so he only managed to graze it. That was when the other harpies swung back around and whipped past him once more. He tried to roll out of the way again, but this time one of the raptors managed to slash him across the back as it flew past. The cut stung, and Black Nail could feel his clothes grow damp as blood seeped from the gash. The hobgoblin's roll ended as he hit one of the nearby crumbling walls. He placed his back up against it, and then brought his dagger up into a guard. Bleeding and tired, Black Nail prepared himself to face the winged terrors again. When the first harpy rushed at him, he grabbed his cloak from off the ground and swung it at the creature. Instinctively, the surprised harpy gripped the long piece of fabric, so Black Nail whipped the cloak around and sent the raptor hurtling off into the nearby brambles. The other 3 harpies that were still in flight dove at him, so Black Nail flipped over the wall at his back. This forced the furiously squawking raptors to fly over him harmlessly. Black Nail smiled mockingly at the stupid feathered beasts. They weren't so tough. That was when the first harpy that had attacked him pounced on his back. Black Nail shrieked in pain and tried to throw the creature off, but it had its claws dug in deep. As he futilely tried to reach around and stab the harpy with his knife, it suddenly and unexpectedly released him. Black Nail rolled through the dirt as he hissed in pain, but the urge to survive raged through him and drove him to act. He landed on his feet with his dagger up, as he spat loose feathers from his mouth. "Stupid man-faced birds, I'll cut you all up," the hobgoblin roared. He had expected to immediately have a face full of furious harpy, but it didn't happen. It soon became obvious why. A goblin had shoved a spear up the raptor's ass. A wave of angry shrieking goblins had rushed out of their den, and were in the process of finishing off the 2 grounded harpies. The green mob filled the clearing. Several of them were mercilessly stabbing each of the flailing raptors with stone-tipped spears. Several more rushed over to Black Nail and surrounded him protectively. They waved their spears and jeered at the 3 harpies that were still flying around. The now very outnumbered winged beasts apparently didn't want to keep fighting. They twisted in the air and started flapping towards the woods. A few seconds later, as Black Nail watched, they let out one last angry shriek before disappearing into the trees. Black Nail let out a deep sigh of relief as the goblins around him began cheering at the top of their lungs. Now that the fight was over, he grunted in pain as he awkwardly tried to stand up straight. That fight could have gone a lot better. There was no way he was going to be able to start after Herat and Cedar now. He had to clean and patch all the new wounds he had just gotten. Not to mention he wasn't exactly feeling up to a long run. Oh well, it wasn't all bad. At least he had a safe place to sleep and recuperate. Of course it was full of annoying little runts. He kind of, but not really, owed them one though. So he could also use the time to teach the goblins a trick or two. Just so they could survive without a hobgoblin around to look after them. After getting a nearby goblin to grab him some more food and patching his wounds, Black Nail went straight to work. The most important thing was that the goblins were able to protect themselves. That way he could leave without having to worry about them being attacked as soon as his back was turned. If the harpies came back, the goblins would need slings. Even a small goblin could do a fair bit of damage with a sling, and they worked well against flying targets. Then again, a rock to the face worked against almost everything. He didn't have nearly enough cloth to make slings though. How else could he do it? Well, the goblins had shown they could make twine, so maybe he could use that. Less than an hour later, the hobgoblin was laughing excitedly as he launched a small rock across the clearing using the twine sling he had just made. It had worked. He truly was a genius. Immediately, Black Nail grabbed several nearby goblins and forced them to make twine. He had to smack them a few times to keep them from slipping away, but once they knew what he wanted, they went to work. The gray-haired goblin that had guided him to the creek was there, and Black Nail didn't have to hit him at all. That was an impressive amount of intelligence for a goblin. When he had enough twine, he then got the goblins to watch him make another sling and use it. The weapon apparently impressed the goblins, or maybe they just liked mimicking the hobgoblin, because soon the air was full of flying rocks. That also meant the ground was soon littered with goblins who had welts and bumps decorating their heads. He should have seen that coming. Even Black Nail had to dodge the occasional rock that shot past his head. He couldn't figure out which goblin, or conspiracy of goblins, it was that kept doing that. His plan to discipline them by giving them all a good kicking also failed. There were just too many of them, and the little runts were quick when they wanted to be. Stupid ungrateful idiots, he muttered to himself. Clearly he had to rethink things. How did Herat control so many bandits? She had lieutenants like Cedar and Red Dog. Could he train a goblin? The gray-haired goblin had shown something that mimicked intelligence, kind of. He was also standing right beside Black Nail, which placed within easy reach. With his mind made up, the hobgoblin began instructing the gray-haired goblin on how to use a sling. "You boss goblin now," the hobgoblin told his wide-eyed follower. "You boss," the goblin repeated. Black Nail sighed. Well, language wasn't important anyway. It was time for phase 2 of his goblin-proof plan. Black Nail handed Grey Hair a spear, and then had him go around smacking the other goblins with it. If they tried to fight back, Black Nail gave them a solid kick, and that was that. Thus, did Grey Hair rise in the pack hierarchy. After repeating the process 2 more times, Black Nail had trained himself some loyal lieutenants. Now if the stupid tribe of goblins didn't do as the hobgoblin wanted, it was his lieutenant's problem, because he would take it out on them. That was much less smacking that Black Nail had to do, and while it started out fun, it quickly became just more work. His plan worked flawlessly, because he was a genius. Soon Black Nail had the goblins under his, almost, complete control. He kept them very busy while he recuperated. With the help of his new lieutenants, he managed to force most the goblins to practice slinging stones without anyone getting hurt. Next on the list was fortifying the den some more. First, Black Nail started constructing some more stone axes. He copied the horned hobgoblin's simple design. A sharpened stone was wedged into the split top of a length of wood, and then wrapped in twine. He had goblins use the axes to cut down saplings. The work went quickly with 24 goblins all working together, especially since if one of the goblins wasn't working fast enough, they got poked by one of the hobgoblin's spear-wielding lieutenants. Black Nail knew how to motivate goblins. The wood from the saplings was used to reinforce the trapdoor, and then to add 2 smaller trapdoors to the back tunnel and the fireplace. With the leftover poles he was even able to make himself a raised platform to sleep on. It was good to be chief. Once that was done he taught the goblins how to make snares, and how to use them to catch rabbits and squirrels. This greatly increased the amount of meat the goblins caught, and Black Nail cooked stew again that night. After a fire-lit feast under the stars, Black Nail and the tribe withdrew underground. The room below was barely recognizable now. The flickering orange light of the fireplace illuminated the old cellar. Thanks to the den's new doors the fire also warmed the cold stone walls of the chamber. Most of the trash had also been removed, and the place now smelled of flybane instead of goblin stuff. The less he thought about that the better. From his place on his newly constructed bed Black Nail yawned and snuggled into his blankets. He felt good enough that tomorrow he would probably be able to hit the road again. For now though he just wanted to enjoy this rare moment of comfort. He was just about to fall asleep when heard a goblin approach. He opened his eye to see a female approach and began to lick his face. She was tall and skinny for a goblin, and had short black hair. Black Nail found her attractive, and he smiled in anticipation as blood rushed to his lower regions. It had been quite a while since the last time a female goblin had shown interest in him. Black Nail rolled over and sniffed the female. Lust built up in him as he took in her aroma. He growled in appreciation and his heartbeat quickened. Just as he was about to mount her, 2 other female goblins moved over and began to lick him as well. Black Nail's smile grew even wider. He was definitely enjoying being a hobgoblin, and was without a doubt glad he'd come back to help this tribe. His master in Harad would be fine without him for a few days. How dangerous could this place Dagger Point be? A long twisted path 7. The morning sunlight shone down gently on Black Nail as he jogged. He'd been very busy yesterday. The hobgoblin had been so busy he hadn't even had time to hunt. Instead he'd made the goblins he'd been staying with bring him food and water, while he was busying. A satisfied grin was plastered across his face as he headed down the road, and he was feeling quite cheerful. This was despite the fact that he had no idea where he was going or what he was going to do when he got there. It sure was a nice day out though. Harad and her men's trail had long since faded, and it wasn't like he could stop and ask for directions either. His clothes had been torn apart by his recent scuffles and didn't serve as much of a disguise anymore. Unless he was trying to disguise himself as a hobgoblin wearing rags. This left him with 2 options. Turn back towards camp and hang out with Red Dog, or continue on down the road and hope it led him to Harad before winter came. He chose the latter. Red Dog was no fun, and he was pretty sure that if he just followed the sound of screams that Harad would be close by. She was funny like that. Whenever Black Nail heard or saw someone approaching he would slip into the woods and hide among the trees. He didn't want to draw any attention to himself or get delayed any more than he already had been. It wasn't like the passing humans had anything he wanted anyway. He hadn't wasted the time he had spent recuperating with the goblin tribe. His backpack was stuffed full of fresh supplies. Before leaving them he had smoked quite a few strips of meat and collected several handfuls of nuts and berries. This meant he wouldn't need to stop to restock for quite a while, and could thus keep moving the entire day. Hopefully, that would help him make up for some of the time he had lost. The forest on both sides of the road was full of birdsong and the occasional sound of creatures scurrying through the underbrush. The trees were mostly the triangular needle-covered kind instead of the ones with leaves. The ground itself was uneven and rocky. It had only the thinnest amount of soil on it and large sections of stone were exposed. As Black Nail jogged around the next corner he was presented with a rather serious problem. Harpy teeth SS and damnation, he growled angrily as he took in the sight before him. The road forked, it split in 2 and both parts went in completely different directions. Black Nail had no idea which one he was supposed to go down. He tried to find some sign or scent of his tribe's passing, but was unsurprised when he discovered nothing. As he circled the crossroads for what must have been the 10th time he suddenly detected a noise. It sounded a lot like heavy footsteps, especially those of horses. Quickly, Black Nail slipped into the nearby bushes before he could be seen. As he watched from his hiding place a group of humans came down the road. There were about 3 dozen of them and they all wore heavy packs. Their clothing was more than a little faded but it still seemed oddly colorful to Black Nail. Red and blue of various shades decorated their outfits. Among their number there were 3 men and 2 women on horseback. Black Nail could already smell the foul beasts, the horses not the men. Their mounts also seemed to be carrying a lot of baggage. He had seen their like before on missions for Harad. These humans were traitors. When they got to the fork in the road they started heading south the way Black Nail had just come from. The hobgoblin eyed them carefully. They seemed to know where they were going. Perhaps he could somehow arrange to get this useful bit of information from them. The hobgoblin waited until they had passed him by, and then began to stalk after them. It wasn't hard since they weren't exactly moving quickly, or being all that observant. Black Nail easily slipped through the bushes behind them unseen. Seriously, what was up with their colorful clothing? None of the human merchants seemed too dangerous, but there were way too many of them for Black Nail to overcome alone. In broad daylight his torn-up clothes wouldn't disguise him, so approaching them was also out. That left him with only one option. He had to somehow get one of them away from the rest of the herd. That way he could get some answers out of them. How could he do that though? Humans such as these tended to stick together. The hobgoblin picked up speed and moved up ahead of the traders. A plan was starting to form in his head. When you baited animals you used food. So what did humans value instead of food? The answer was shiny coins, and Black Nail had some of those. Once he was a fair bit ahead of the human party, the grinning hobgoblin broke from cover. He raced to the edge of the road and placed his open coin pouch beside a patch of thick bushes. He then hid himself nearby, and smiled eagerly in anticipation as he waited for someone to fall into his clever trap. It didn't happen. The stupid bloody humans were obviously blind because not one of them noticed the pouch. Not a single one of them. After they had all passed by, the grumbling hobgoblin emerged from hiding and started running ahead of the humans so he could try again. This time Black Nail placed the pouch somewhere more obvious, and scattered a few coins around it decoratively. Then, after a second of thought, he tied the pouch to a bit of string. That way he could draw his prey in even closer. With his trap set, the hobgoblin once again hid himself nearby and waited. A human had better notice the pouch this time or he was going to get really mad. As the traveling merchants were passing him by for the second time, a man at the back of the group happened to glance in the right direction. His eyes went wide in surprise as he noticed the pouch, but then he quickly looked away. Nonchalantly, the man began to slow his pace and fall to the back of the group. Black Nail smiled excitedly from his hiding spot. That was perfect. Some suitable prey had noticed the bait. Once the rest of the merchants had moved past the coin sack, the man hurriedly walked off the road and towards the pouch. With a wary glance back over his shoulder to make sure none of the other merchants were looking in his direction, the man made his way over to the bushes. He then smiled greedily as he reached down to pick up the unexpected windfall. Right before he could pick it up, however, the pouch seemed to slide deeper into the shrubs. The man frowned and took a step after it. Then he froze as his eyes went wide in realization. Coin pouches didn't usually move themselves. It was, however, much too late for him. Off to one side, Black Nail suddenly lunged from out of the bushes. Before his prey could even blink, the hobgoblin was behind him with a dagger pressed firmly against his throat. "Don't tss fight or talk ss," Black Nail whispered as he pulled the terrified man into the bushes and completely out of sight of anyone on the road. "What? Oh gods, you're not human," the man whispered with obvious terror as he visibly paled. "Stupid man ss, that's obvious. Will ask ss questions here, not you," Black Nail replied viciously as he pushed the now shaking man into the woods. Once they had gone a few feet further in, Black Nail stopped and looked the traitor directly in the eyes. The man flinched and whimpered. Black Nail had to fight a sudden urge to smack some sense into his prisoner. Then he had to fight the urge to stab him. "Which way is dagger point?" the hobgoblin asked the man as he pulled the knife tighter. "What, you can talk," the stunned man replied. Black Nail sighed. Why was this man so stupid? With his free hand, Black Nail grabbed the man's shoulder and squeezed until his sharp nails drew blood. His prisoner whimpered in pain before gasping. "Still obvious, answer ss my question." Black Nail growled. "It's north. Dagger point is north of here," the man whimpered. "Again, that's obvious. Back the way ss you came, which road would you take?" the hobgoblin asked scornfully. The left. "It's the left road," was the traitor's frantic reply. Black Nail considered this answer for a second. How did he know the man wasn't lying? "I'm going to tie you up, and go ss capture another human. If he says different from USS, then you will both die," Black Nail explained untruthfully. "That would be way too much work." "It's left, I swear," the man repeated. Black Nail thought he was probably telling the truth. The whimpering man was obviously a coward and he had no reason to lie anyway. "Take off your clothes, then lay face down on the ground," Black Nail commanded as he took a step back and drew his sword. The man just stood there for a second with a startled expression, but when Black Nail waved his sword at him, he immediately began getting undressed. When the whimpering man was naked and laying on his stomach, Black Nail picked up his clothes and addressed him. "Look up and I stab you," Black Nail warned him. Then the hobgoblin immediately began creeping silently away. After he was a fair distance away, he broke out into a run. Honestly, he had really wanted to stab the dumb human, but it would have broken Herod's rules. The man was a merchant, and he had been told to rob but not kill them. That way he could rob them again later. That made perfect sense to Black Nail. That human merchant had been so stupid he could probably rob him several more times the same way. In fact, Black Nail was already considering several ways to improve his human trap. He could place the pouch over a covered pit. That would mean a lot of digging though. Oh, he could place it beside a giant snare like the one Cedar had used on him. No, that would be way too noisy. He obviously needed to knock them unconscious somehow. With a new set of clothes and another pouch of shiny human bait to add to his own, Black Nail headed towards the left fork in the road. He was relieved that he had managed to get back on his tribe's trail without too much of a problem. It had even been more than a little fun. He was certainly a genius among hobgoblins. A few hours later, after heading down the left road, he had to stop again. He had arrived at yet another crossroads. He growled in frustration. How many bloody roads did humans need? He probably should have asked the man about the entire way to Dagger Point. Black Nail spent quite a while circling the area futilely. The time he was wasting frustrated him, and he began to growl and hiss to himself. He couldn't just choose a path and follow it though, he could end up anywhere. He had no choice but to wait for someone to come by, hopefully before tomorrow. It grew dark before any other travelers appeared, but much to Black Nail's relief eventually some did. Disguised by the darkness and his new outfit, Black Nail was able to simply approach this group and ask directions. The humans turned out to be a pair of hunters returning to their camp. When he asked them directions, they were more than happy to help him out, but they warned him Dagger Point was a vile den of thieves and murderers. For his own good, they didn't want to tell him how to get there. After a brief conversation, he managed to convince them though. He told them he needed to find some of his tribe, or family as humans called it, who had headed there and who needed his protection. Kiddo was likely dragging Cedar into danger right this moment. What would they do without him to look out for them? The huntsman thus gave him detailed instructions on how to get to Dagger Point, and wished him luck in finding his family. Their instructions were rather long. Apparently, there were more than a few crossroads between the hobgoblin and the city. The world sure was a large place. After a heartfelt thanks and friendly wave goodbye to the two helpful men, Blacknail wandered off to find somewhere to hole up for the night. The huntsman had offered to let him camp with them, but Blacknail hadn't thought that would be a good idea. They seemed far more observant than the last pair of humans he had spent the night with, and also more dangerous. The hobgoblin eventually found a good hollow tree to sleep in, and drifted off. The next morning he was up and on his way to Dagger Point. The hobgoblin traveled that way for several days, and actually made fairly good time. The mountains in the distance grew larger and larger as he followed the road north. Then at last the hobgoblin arrived outside the city of Dagger Point, or at least he hoped it was Dagger Point. He didn't see any actual dagger, with or without a point. Blacknail stood upon a hill that looked down at the valley below. The city stretched out through the valley below him. It was an ugly place and noticeably smaller than most the other cities Blacknail had seen before. Both the city he had grown up in and Riverdown had been much bigger. Of course he had only seen Riverdown from a distance. Other than that, the first thing he noticed about the city was that they used a lot of wood, forests worth of the stuff. The wall that encircled the city was made completely from lumber and practically every building he could see was as well. The stone most other cities used to make buildings was almost nowhere to be seen. Near the center of the settlement there was one large fancy-looking house that stood on the largest hill in the area. It was much larger than any of the other buildings, and stood entirely alone. At the base of the hill was what looked like some sort of fence, and the only greenery in the entire city lay within it. Blacknail thought the large house would be a good place to look for Harad. She always took the largest building as her own whenever she moved somewhere. All the other homes and other structures seemed to be placed haphazardly. Blacknail couldn't see a single straight road that lasted more than a few hundred feet. Everything seemed randomly placed and hastily built. All this combined to make Blacknail think the entire place could be set aflame by one well-placed fire. He was even briefly tempted to try it. He should probably find Harad and Cedar first though. The fun stuff would have to wait until later. The hobgoblin scanned the city walls as he looked for a way in. The road he was on ran down the hill and through a gate in the wall. Two men stood outside the gate and briefly looked over everyone who entered. They didn't appear to be checking everyone too carefully or going through their stuff. Blacknail briefly considered just walking through, but decided not to risk it. It wasn't like he would be able to casually walk the streets during the day anyway. He would instead just wait for night and scale the walls. They didn't seem very hobgoblin-proof, but then again few things were. Blacknail sat down to relax as he snacked and watched the city from his hillside lookout. He could be patient when the reward was great enough. Several hours passed and the sky above him darkened. For a while light shone out of most of the buildings in the city, but soon most of them died until only a few remained and the valley grew dark. The hobgoblin looked on as the city gates were closed and the guards withdrew. The night air was crisp and the moon was high in the sky when Blacknail finally descended the hill and approached the walls. As he strolled along their lengths he ran his fingers over their rough dry exterior, and then he smiled as his claws found purchase in the timbers. He continued walking though until he found a spot where the other side of the barrier was both dark and silent. Then, with an eager smile he dug his nails into the wood and began to climb. His lean but muscled body made it hardly any effort at all. Soon, the hobgoblin was perched atop the wall. His cloak rippled in the wind as the breeze blew in from over the dark forest behind him. He looked down to see several squat ramshackle buildings separated by a dark alley. Beyond them stretched a seemingly endless maze of wood and stone. Despite its rundown appearance even at night the city was alive with noise. Off in the distance he heard a chorus comprised of the clatter of footsteps and human voices raised in both fear and joy. As he listened a shriek of pain filled the air from only a few streets away. It sure sounded like the people inside were having a lot of fun. The hobgoblin couldn't wait to join in. Blacknail smiled as he began to climb down into the alley. He was very glad he had made the journey north and not stayed in the camp. This place seemed like it was going to be a very enjoyable place to visit. There were so many wonderful treats just waiting to be plucked and trapped here. It made him feel all tingly inside just thinking about it. He reached the ground and began walking out towards the street. The alley around him was piled high with refuse, but he didn't mind. Ahead of him flashes of warm light could be seen as doors and shutters were opened and closed off in the distance. The hobgoblin scanned the nearby buildings. Several of them seemed in bad repair and probably abandoned. Humans sure liked abandoning buildings. Well, it made it easy for him to find somewhere safe to sleep though. Blacknail laughed at the very idea of someone finding him in this twisted wooden human hive. It would be like trying to search for a single mimic in an entire forest, and just as dangerous for the searchers. Also, unlike out in the forest there were no dangerous beasts here. The wooden wall and the thick human stench behind it kept them out. In this city there were just blind, deaf, and stupid humans. Blacknail chuckled darkly in amusement. Well, there had been no dangerous beasts in the city. Now there was him. Interlude, for love and duty. The press shifted towards him, and Urlain readied himself for it. Out of the corner of his eye he saw one of his men fall with a spear lodged in his guts. Another spear stabbed towards Urlain's own face, but he batted it aside with his shield. Then, in one fluid movement he then knocked the spear's shaft down with his blade and stepped forward to counterattack. His slash was stopped by his opponent's mail shirt but the impact knocked the man off balance. Urlain's second slash was lower and bit into his opponent's unprotected inner thigh. The man crumpled as blood spewed from his artery, and Urlain kicked his weapon away. Then he had to shift his attention to the next member of the Elorian militia that charged him. He managed to take this one down with a single blow to the neck. The Elorian army really needed to train its soldiers better. Maybe they believed in quantity over quality though, because there was no lack of militia around to take the man's place. Warland's vision was full of tightly packed soldiers in blue. They pushed inexorably towards him like a crashing wave. Luckily, he had his own mob of violent killers to watch his back. Hold the line, and ready for impact. Not one of you takes a single step back. We're going to break these Elorian lilies before us. Urlain roared to the rank of spearmen around him as he brandished his blade. It was stupid to draw attention to himself in such a way, but he had a weakness for the dramatic. Behind him spears that had fallen as their wielders had tired were suddenly raised and thrust forward all at once to form a bristling wall. Then there was a chorus of heavy thuds and angry shouts as all the spearmen under Urlain's command stepped forward to meet their enemy's charge. The mercenary lieutenant let his men engulf him and move past. He had done enough fighting for now. The two sides had become too tightly packed for sword fighting, and he could use a break anyway. He sheathed his sword and stepped back to get a better view of the battlefield. It was probably time for him to do some real officer work and stop playing around. Hundreds of men screamed and fought over the muddy field that lay before Urlain. Soldiers wearing the blue of Eloria clashed with men clad in the yellow and green of Count Aron var Istabulin. Off to one side of the battlefield were the plain mismatched uniforms of the Silver Blades, the mercenary band Urlain held a commission in. He frowned as he observed the flow of the battle. It didn't look good. The Elorian forces were pushing the Count's forces back. The Count's men were fighting hard, but they were simply outnumbered by the Elorians. That group of archers over on the hill there also seemed to be doing a great deal of damage to the Count's flank. Well, there's not much I can do about that now. Where are the cavalry though? Warland muttered to himself as he looked around. The Count was supposed to have a sizable division of heavy cavalry. It was one of the reasons the captain agreed to this commission in the first place, that and he was supposed to be rich. The captain was always saying that mercenaries had to prioritize staying alive and getting paid, in that order. Warland didn't disagree. So, where in all the hells was that cavalry? If they didn't show up soon the Count's left flank was going to collapse, and then the Elorian infantry there would spill forward towards the Silver Blades. That would be very bad. There were a lot of the Horse Sons. Suddenly the sound of trumpets filled the air, and Warland's head spun towards the source of the noise. Off in the distance across the torn-up fields that lay before him a group of horsemen charging out from behind a hill, and towards the rear of the Elorian forces. One of the riders held a green and yellow banner that streamed through the air behind him. A smile appeared on the mercenary officer's lips as he watched them barrel towards the now panicking Elorians. There was the cavalry. Almost immediately the frantic sound of trumpets and signal drums filled the air as the entire battlefield shifted in the face of this new development. The Elorians began to pull back as they tried to deal with this new threat. Even the militia fighting Warland's own men soon disengaged. A ragged cheer broke out through the ranks of the Silver Blades as their opponents retreated. Let them go. We're not getting paid per head so there's no point pursuing them, lads, the lieutenant ordered his men. He watched the battle for a few more minutes, but when the cavalry tore through the Elorians' archers and the rest of their army kept retreating it was plain the day was won. The Count was no fool, he had sprung his surprise at just the right time. The Elorians had been strung out and too engaged to respond properly. After one last glance back Warland put his second in command and headed off to find the other Silver Blade officers. He flipped off his helmet and removed his gauntlets as he walked. There was nothing more he could do here, and he had gotten quite thirsty. It had been a long hot day of fighting and a glass of wine would really hit the spot. A few minutes later he approached the Silver Blade's large grey command tent. The sound of arguing voices echoed out from within, and he sighed. The captain must not be present. Warland swaggered into the large brown tent to see what was going on. The inside of the pavilion was unlit but enough sunlight streamed through the entrances and gaps in the fabric walls that it wasn't an issue. Several large mats had been thrown over the ground, and a wooden table was set up in the center of the room. It was covered in maps and surrounded by several plain wooden chairs. Just as Warland had expected most the other Silver Blades lieutenants were present but not the captain. Two military-looking men were seated at the table and another two were standing beside it. A servant also stood off to one side. I see you all survived to annoy each other another day. I hope the same can be said for the others. Any of you know where the captain is? Warland asked as he walked in. The others all turned towards him, and a younger man who was leaning back in his chair and had his feet resting on the table replied. You just lost me 5 copper, Warland. I'd bet the others that you'd finally gotten yourself killed. Damn, and it seemed like a sure thing. The fighting was thick and heavy in your area, and for some completely unfathomable reason you feel the need to fight on the front lines. I mean look at you. You were obviously just doing it. How are you alive? The man joked. I am a knight of Azawach, Rawguide. I am dedicated to the god of war, and do not fear death or battle, Warland replied with a smile, as he stepped forward and pushed the other man's feet off the table. Ugh, not that nonsense again. I thank the gods every day that I wasn't born a third son. If I had been then my parents might have tried to send me off to be a paladin as well, and then I'd be just as stupid as you, Rawguide shot back. Before Warland could reply, or pour himself a glass of wine, the doorway of the tent darkened as the captain and the last lieutenant entered. Warland let out a relieved breath he'd been unaware of holding in when he saw them. In the back of his mind he'd been afraid something had happened to them. Captain Hyrus was a thickly built older man with a large mustache and a shaved head. As a veteran of many battlefields and wars he had a commanding aura that dominated any room he was in. Everyone in the room went quiet and straightened their posture as he gazed their way. Of course, he was small compared to the woman that stood behind him. Lieutenant Borshaw was a very tall and muscular woman, but Warlin still found her attractive. She gave him a friendly grin as she entered and he replied with a respectful nod. Captain Hyrus turned and gave all the lieutenants in front of him a stern grin. I'd like to congratulate you all on not screwing this up, and surviving another day. I was just speaking to the Count and he's more than satisfied with our contributions to the fight. He even praised the skill of our troops. He told me we had grit. Basically, that means we can expect to get paid for this job and maybe we just might get a bonus as well, he told them. Here's to getting paid. Rawhide announced as he raised his cup and then took a drink of wine. You can all take the rest of the day off, except you Rawhide. You're in charge of cleanup, because you look like you're already all rested up, the captain responded with a scowl. Rawhide however just smiled and threw the captain a messy salute. Will we be moving on soon? One of the other lieutenants asked. Probably, the Elorians are unlikely to mount another offensive into this part of Helgeron. They got pretty solidly thrashed here today. The Count seems like he's too shrewd a man to be willing to pay us good gold just to sit around, so we'll have to find a new employer, Captain Hyrule explained. That's fine with me. The pay is nice but there's nothing but muddy fields and peasant shacks around here. Hopefully, the next place we fight has wine, food good, and beautiful women, one of the other lieutenants replied. You forgot to mention good-looking men, instead of all you sweaty pigs. Vorshaw added with a laugh. There were smiles all around at her comment, although some of them were strained. Warlin himself found it hard to conceal a grimace. Her casual joke had unexpectedly drawn blood. He knew he wasn't the most handsome of men. His nose was a little too large and his other features were bland. The mercenaries made small talk for a few more minutes before the captain dismissed them and sent them on their way. Warlin slipped out at the same time as Vorshaw. I hear you were fighting on the front lines again, Warlin. Unlike the others, I'm not surprised you managed to walk away unharmed. You take that paladin stuff of yours seriously, and you're one of the best fighters I've ever seen. I wish I could have joined you, but the captain had me serving as his second. I couldn't exactly tell him no, no matter how much I wanted to wet my blade, Vorshaw told him as they walked out. Warlin felt himself flush slightly at the compliment despite an effort on his part to remain stoic-looking. In truth, he didn't actually consider himself a great fighter or a particularly dedicated paladin. He simply didn't know how to act other than the way he had been trained. Coming from you, that compliment is a great honor. You're also one of the best fighters I've ever come across, and you didn't have all the advantages my birth and training gave me. I'm not exceptional for a knight of Azawaj, but you're definitely something special, he replied honestly. She gave him a happy smile and they continued happily discussing swordsmanship and fighting techniques for a few minutes before splitting up and heading to different parts of the camp. Warlin gazed after Vorshaw as she walked away for a few moments before continuing on his way. With a regretful sigh he wandered off to his tent to clean up and catch some rest. Once he was lying down, it only took a few minutes for him to slip asleep. He had long ago grown used to the unpredictable schedule of a soldier. He woke as someone opened his tent's flap, and he immediately drew the knife he always slept beside. When he opened his eyes, though, the sight of one of his men greeted him, so he relaxed. The captain wants you at the command post now. Something's up, his subordinate told Warlin. The mercenary lieutenant frowned in confusion. Why would the captain want to see him now? Had the Elorians gotten reinforcements? No, that didn't make sense, they would have heard about it long before it became urgent. I'm on my way. Thank you, Private, he told the other man as he quickly got dressed. Once he was clothed and armed, he strode quickly to the command tent. It would be poor form to keep his superior officer waiting, but if he ran it might alarm the common soldiers. Voices greeted him as he approached. This doesn't add up. I know the men they're talking about, and they're not the type to do something like this. Rawhide was telling the captain as Warlin entered. You're just trying to cover your own ass, one of the other lieutenants interjected scornfully. What's going on? Warlin asked with concern. The captain turned to him and answered. His eyes were dark and his face was wrinkled with worry as he spoke. Several of Rawhide's men were arrested about an hour ago. Apparently they were caught trying to steal coin from the Count's pay chest. I'm told they've already confessed, and that several others were with them but got away with a significant amount of coin. The Count is furious, the captain answered. I'm telling you that story doesn't make sense. He won't even let me see my men. He has them locked away where I can't get at them. It's bloody suspicious, is what it is, Rawhide added with obvious frustration. Several of the other mercenaries began to speak up. Most of them seemed to blame Rawhide and disagree with him. The captain however was silent, and looked like he'd just swallowed a spine toad. Quiet all of you. Unfortunately, I have to agree with Rawhide on this. This smells more than a little fishy. It might be some sort of attempt by the Count to lower our pay. I'll have to go speak with him myself and try to sort it out. I want the company on full alert until I get back, he told them. I'll go with you, you'll need someone at your back, Vorshaw commented. No, I'm going alone. Stay here and help get things organized. I want to know where every single one of our men is when I get back, he replied as he walked out of the tent. As soon as he was gone, the other lieutenants began to talk and argue among themselves. Warlin didn't approve, they should be out fulfilling their duties. Before he could say anything though, Vorshaw spoke up. Hey, let's get moving. The captain gave us orders, she announced loudly enough to overwhelm everyone else who was talking. Indeed, we have a job to do. So let's do it, Warlin added in support of Vorshaw. No one liked being talked down to, but they knew they were in the wrong, so soon everyone was out of the tent and moving through the camp. Once again Warlin found himself walking alongside Vorshaw. I hope the captain can sort this mess out, he commented. I just hope he comes back unharmed. I met the count and he's a typical noble snake. It wouldn't surprise me at all if he stabbed us in the back, Vorsha replied with obvious anger. Warlin raised an eyebrow. As the third son of a knight, and a landless knight himself, he was also a noble. Vorsha must have seen the look on his face because she hesitated. You're obviously an exception. I mean, as a knight you get your hands dirty so you're hardly a noble at all really, she told him cheerfully as she gave him a friendly slap across the back. He had fight to keep his balance as the friendly blow almost sent him sprawling forward. He turned around and gave her a complicated expression. Thanks, I think, he replied with more than a little sarcasm, and then he rubbed his sore back. Just then one of the younger mercenaries in his squad ran up. The lad looked exhausted and more than a little scared. Instantly, Warlin's hand went to the hilt of his blade for reassurance as he felt a spike of worry. This didn't look good. Lieutenant, they've arrested him. They've arrested the captain, the lad babbled. Shit, Vorsha swore. Quickly, Warlin reached out and took the panicking private by the shoulder. He couldn't have the lad spreading rumors throughout the camp and starting a wildfire of panic. Calm down, private. Now tell me what happened, quietly, he commanded the lad. I was walking through the main camp when I saw the captain walk up to that count's big OLE tent. When he approached the count's guards drew their blades and surrounded him. They said he was under arrest for planning the theft of some gold or something. Sir, the captain then tried to draw his blade but one of them guards smacked him down from behind and knocked him out good. Then the bastards dragged him away, sir, the young private explained excitedly. Double shit, Vorsha hissed angrily. Private, you're coming with us. We need to inform the rest of the officers, Warlin said as he considered the fact that there might be a battle today after all. After sending out messengers and quite a bit of running around, Warlin found himself addressing the other lieutenants. When he relayed what had happened to them, most of them looked shocked and angry. There's no way the captain had anything to do with any theft, if there even was such a thing. That damned count must be trying to get out of paying us, one of the officers said. He probably wants to conscript our men as well. Why pay mercenaries when you can just force them to work for free, someone else added. Fucking hells. What do we do, Warlin? You're the most senior lieutenant since Kvar retired, Rogide cursed. Warlin felt a flash of panic as he realized the other man was right. He was in charge now, at least as long as the other lieutenants accepted it. He quickly gave them a quick glance to try and determine where they stood. Most of them seemed too scared or shocked to question his authority. He doubted anyone would challenge him for the position. It wasn't like he really wanted it though. As he gazed around the room he fell deep into thought. What were their options, and what would the repercussion of each action be? The way he figured, it basically came down to surrendering or trying to fight their way out. He didn't like either option much. If we surrender I question our value to the count. He'll have little use for officers of questionable loyalty, Warlin told the others. Right, if I were him I'd have us arrested and disposed of as well, a nervous Rogide added. If we fight though, our chances aren't great. Our best bet would be to immediately try and cut ourselves a path northwest towards Eloria. That way the count would hesitate to follow us, but on the other hand we might run into the Elorian army, Warlin continued. We don't really have another choice though, do we? Another officer asked. No, we don't. Fuck surrendering, let's bloody these backstabbing bastards, Vorsha growled. With their course decided, Warlin immediately began mobilizing the company, and planning their strategy. He was interrupted though when a runner arrived. It's the count. He's marshaled his forces and is coming to arrest us all, the messenger told him. Damn him to all the hells. Warlin swore as he leaned over the map table. It was too soon. They weren't going to be able to make it to safety this way. The bastard must have been preparing to march even before he arrested the captain. He'd had this entire ploy planned out since the beginning. Damn him. One of us is going to have to stay behind and lead a holding action to buy the other's time, Warlin. I volunteer, she told him. Warlin's throat went dry and he felt himself sway as a wave of panic ran through him. That would be suicide. He couldn't let her do that. No, I'm in command and I chose this course. I'll lead the rear guard. It's my responsibility, he announced as sternly as he could as he stared Vorsha down. The muscular woman looked startled but quickly opened her mouth to argue with him. He wasn't going to let that happen though. Shut up. Get your men moving, Vorsha. I've given you an order, now move, he hissed at her with as much false anger as he could manage. She flushed red with fury at his words and still looked like she wanted to argue, so Warlin pointed to the door and then turned away dismissively. He heard a furious hiss of anger followed by heavy footsteps as she left. When she was gone he let out a relieved sigh. She would be safe now, as long as he did his part anyway. Quickly, Warlin got to work and prepared to defend the camp. Orders had to be given and soldiers found. He couldn't fight the Count's forces by himself. When the first men wearing the yellow and green of the Count's forces began to stream over the nearby hill he was waiting for them at the edge of the Silver Blades camp. Behind him stood a platoon of volunteers formed up into a shield wall. It would have been more impressive if his men hadn't been so outnumbered. He supposed it didn't really matter though. All they had to do was delay them, and they were dead anyway. Warlin watched the enemy form up across the field. He didn't see any cavalry, which could be good or very very bad. He hoped the Count hadn't thought them necessary to subdue a mere company of mercenaries. To the lieutenant's surprise the enemy troops began to march forward. He had half been expecting the Count to try and parley. He looked back to the grim faces of his own soldiers. To his own surprise he found he didn't really feel like making a speech. What could he possibly say? Still he felt he had to say something. I don't know about you men, but I'm going to try and kill as many of these bastards as possible. If any of you lads manage to kill more than me, then I'll be buying you a drink in the next world, Warlin shouted. There were a few half-hearted cheers and chuckles as Warlin stepped back. He raised his shield and took his place in the wall. An eternity and several seconds later the first wave of green and yellow washed over them. Familiar screams of defiance, rage, and fear sounded out from all around him. The sound of heavy impacts and wood splintering filled the air as the Count's forces threw themselves against their shields, but they held their ground and the enemy's momentum broke. Next came the swords. Warlin stabbed forward as men all around began to do the same. Blades flashed through the air and tore through the ranks of the enemy. Warlin began to lose track of time as he hacked and slashed. Spears nicked him and he began to bleed heavily. Oddly enough he felt no pain though as he pushed himself to keep fighting. His men fell around him until only yellow and green remained. The world became a blur as he struggled to kill as much as possible before being killed. Feeling leaked from him as he drowned in red. He had no idea how long he had been fighting. Suddenly he felt himself sag and collapse into the mud. He struggled to rise, but couldn't for some reason beyond his understanding. As he started to fade away his last thought was of Vorshaw's smiling face. He wished he had told her how he had truly felt, even if she would have just laughed at him. Then he smiled, at least she was safe now.